Everyone mocked their simple wedding, but instantly regretted it. Maya Collins held Caleb Miller's hand as she felt tears burning in her eyes. The afternoon sun bathed the open field in a golden light, but none of it mattered in the face of the laughter echoing around the small makeshift altar. It was when her cousin Ashley commented loudly enough for everyone to hear that the bride's dress looked like it had been sewn by a thrift store seamstress. The laughter that followed made Caleb squeeze Maya's hand even tighter, as if he wanted to transfer all his strength through that gesture. He knew that kind of humiliation from childhood, when he'd arrive at school with patched clothes and be the target of jokes from the children of the wealthier families in the area. But he never imagined he'd witness it on his own wedding day. The officiant, Mr. Arthur, a 68-year-old man who had known Caleb since the boy was 5, cleared his throat trying to resume the ceremony, but his voice trembled slightly, revealing how much the situation affected him. Maya looked back and saw her mother, Eleanor, sitting among the elegant guests with an expression that mixed satisfaction and sadness. It was as if the woman was saying without words that she had warned this would be a disaster. Caleb, at 28 with a face weathered by the sun from daily work in the fields, kept his posture straight. He wore a simple suit that had belonged to his late grandfather, a piece of fabric no longer in fashion, but which carried a history of dignity. The straw hat he insisted on wearing, even knowing it would cause comments, was his way of not denying who he was. Beside him, the calf Honey, tied with a hand-braided rope, seemed calmer than many of the guests. Maya, at 26, had built her life between two worlds. The daughter of Eleanor and a farm worker who left when she was just 3, she grew up watching her mother struggle to climb socially. Helena achieved this by marrying Richard Sterling, a local businessman who brought material comfort but also constant pressure for Maya to forget her origins. The young woman had become a teacher, an achievement her mother touted as proof the family had moved up in the world. But Maya never forgot the afternoons at her maternal grandmother's house, helping to care for the chickens and learning to make wood-fired sourdough bread. Aunt Alice, Eleanor's older sister, and a 65-year-old woman who had always kept her roots, watched everything from the discreet corner where she had sat with Caleb's neighbors. She wore a simple but well-kept dress, and her attentive eyes missed no detail of the situation. Alice had been the only one in the family to support the marriage from the start, but Eleanor had forbidden her from sitting with the wealthy relatives, claiming her sister would embarrass everyone with her modest clothes. The cousin Brandon, son of a distant cousin of Eleanor's, who had made a fortune in agricultural equipment sales, couldn't stop laughing. He had taken off his expensive jacket and thrown it over one of the folding chairs, rented especially for the ceremony, commenting loudly that not even the furniture was any good. His wife, Tiffany, a woman 20 years his junior who had clearly married for money, laughed at every mean comment as if it were the funniest thing in the world. She was filming everything with her phone, already planning to show her city friends as an example of what not to do at a wedding. It was then that Honey, the calf Caleb had raised since it was born prematurely 7 months ago, began to get agitated. The animal had been the wedding gift Caleb planned to give Maya, a symbol that they would build everything together from the start, caring for and growing alongside the things they raised. But Brandon's loud laugh frightened the creature, which pulled the rope with unexpected force. Caleb tried to hold on, but the rope slipped from his hands when Honey bolted toward the table where the imported drinks Eleanor had insisted on serving were arranged. The frightened, disoriented calf bumped into the legs of the unsteady table. Everything happened in slow motion for Maya. The bottles of expensive wine, the imported champagne, the crystal glasses Eleanor had rented, everything came crashing down onto the party dresses of Tiffany and 3 other women who backed away screaming. The silence that followed was worse than the laughter. Eleanor stood up with an expression of contained fury, her lips pressed into a thin line. Richard, Maya's stepfather, looked at Caleb with a mixture of anger and contempt. Brandon was the first to break the silence, demanding that Caleb pay for Tiffany's dress, which, according to him, had cost more than $1,000. Caleb walked calmly over to Honey. His face was red, but not from shame. It was the restraint of someone who needed to hold himself back from exploding. He held the calf firmly, but without brutality, calming the animal with soft words only the 2 of them could hear. Caleb's grandmother, Nana Mildred, a 73-year-old woman who had raised 5 children alone after her husband passed away during an epidemic decades ago, approached slowly. She had arthritis in her hands, but could still work in the vegetable garden every day, and her presence always brought a sense of peace. Maya couldn't hold back any longer. She turned and ran toward the small house where she had grown up before Eleanor married Richard, and they moved to the downtown penthouse. The simple 3-room structure was still standing at the back of the property where some of Caleb's distant cousins now lived. She went in through the front door, which creaked with the sudden movement, and let herself drop to sit on the floor of time-worn wooden planks. The tears finally came. They weren't tears of simple sadness, but of a deep confusion of feelings. Maya loved Caleb with an intensity that scared her. She had met the young man 2 years earlier, when he was hired to fix the fences on Richard's property. At the time, she came back from the city every weekend to visit her mother, and she began to notice that man who worked with a quiet dedication. Caleb wasn't a man of many words. He arrived early, worked until sunset, and left without fanfare. But Maya noticed he always left the work area cleaner than he found it. He picked up even the smallest pieces of wire so they wouldn't harm the animals, and he treated every tool as if it were a precious treasure. One afternoon, she brought him fresh water, and they started talking. At first about simple things like the weather and the growth of the plants. Then about deeper things. Caleb told her how he had lost his parents in an accident when he was 16, and how his grandmother Mildred had raised him from then on with the help of the community. He had dropped out of school to work and help his grandmother, who no longer had as much strength as before. But he never complained, never blamed life for the hardships. He spoke about the future like someone with a solid plan, not a vague dream. He wanted to have his own land one day, raise cattle with respect for the animals, build an honest life. Maya, in turn, shared her own battles. The weight of being the daughter Eleanor displayed as a trophy of social ascension. The expectations that she would marry a lawyer or doctor, someone who would maintain or elevate the family's status. The constant feeling of betraying her own origins every time she pretended not to know the simple people she grew up with, just so she wouldn't embarrass her mother at social events. In the following months, what began as casual conversations turned into secret meetings. Maya lied to her mother, saying she stayed late at school preparing lessons, when in truth she met Caleb in a small downtown plaza. They would walk, talk, and laugh. Caleb had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard, making her laugh at things no one else found funny, and Maya discovered she could be completely herself around him, without masks or pretenses. When she finally told Eleanor about the relationship, 6 months after their first kiss under an old oak tree, the reaction was violent. Eleanor cried, screamed, accused her daughter of wanting to throw away every opportunity she'd had. Richard was more restrained but equally clear. That relationship was a mistake Maya would regret for the rest of her life. They forbade her from seeing Caleb again. Maya was 25 at the time. She was an adult, financially independent on her teacher's salary. But family pressure is a force hard to resist. For 3 months, she gave in. She stopped seeing Caleb. But the nights were torturous, filled with insomnia and questioning, until Aunt Alice, always observant, noticed her niece's suffering. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like, and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out, now continuing. It was Alice who sought out Maya one Sunday afternoon, finding her alone on the penthouse balcony. The older aunt sat beside her niece and said nothing for long minutes. She just stayed there, her presence solid as an anchor. When she finally spoke, her words were simple but powerful. Eleanor had always been ashamed of where she came from, Alice explained. The two grew up in a family of honest but poor farm workers. Their father, Maya's grandfather, whom she barely got to know, worked from sun-up to sundown on land that wasn't theirs. Their mother took in laundry to supplement the budget. Eleanor and Alice attended school as long as they could, but Eleanor always dreamed of more. There was nothing wrong with that, Alice made clear. Wanting a better life is natural. The problem was what Eleanor did with her origins in the process. When Eleanor met Richard, she was 22 and working as a receptionist at a small accounting firm. Richard, 15 years older and already established in business, was interested in the beautiful, determined young woman. The courtship was quick, the marriage even quicker. And as soon as she put the ring on her finger, Eleanor began erasing her past. She stopped visiting her parents frequently. When her father fell ill, she took weeks to show up. When he passed, she didn't even want a traditional wake, preferring something quick and discreet that wouldn't shame her new social position. Alice watched it all happen, powerless. She tried talking to her sister several times, but Eleanor pushed her away, saying Alice was jealous for not having the same luck. The truth, Alice confessed to Maya that afternoon, was that she had made different choices. She married Dave, an honest, hard-working mechanic who earned little but was a loyal partner. They had 2 sons, raised the boys with love and solid values. Dave had passed from a heart problem 5 years ago, but Alice cherished every memory. She never regretted her choices. The conversation changed something in Maya. She realized she was repeating her mother's pattern, letting the fear of other people's opinions guide her decisions. The next day, she went after Caleb. She found him working on a neighboring property, and when he saw her, his face initially closed into an expression of hurt. But Maya didn't leave. She stayed there, waiting for him to finish his workday, ignoring the hot sun and the curious looks from the other workers. When Caleb finally finished, she apologized. She offered no justifications, nor tried to minimize the pain she had caused. She simply said she had been afraid, but now understood that the greatest fear should be losing what they had. Caleb listened in silence, and when she finished, he simply nodded. They started seeing each other again, but this time Maya no longer hid. She took Caleb to have Sunday lunch at Aunt Alice's house, introduced him to her co-workers, and when Eleanor found out through a gossipy neighbor, Maya did not back down. The marriage proposal came 6 months later, nothing grand or planned. They were walking near a creek, Caleb showing Maya a plot of land he dreamed of buying one day, when he simply asked if she would be willing to build that life with him. Maya said yes before he even finished the sentence. Eleanor became genuinely ill when she learned of the engagement. She spent 3 days in bed, refusing food, saying her daughter was destroying everything she had built. Richard tried to be the mediator, suggesting that perhaps Maya should wait a little longer, meet other people. But Maya was determined. She set the wedding for 6 months later, a time she considered sufficient to prepare everything the way she wanted. The wedding preparations revealed even more the cracks in the family. Eleanor refused to help with any aspect of the ceremony. Richard offered money, but Maya refused, saying she and Caleb would pay for everything with what they had. They wanted a simple wedding in the countryside, with the presence of the people who truly mattered. Alice was the only family member who truly helped, assisting Maya with the decorations, choosing the dress at a thrift store that sold quality pieces for fair prices. Caleb, in turn, prepared everything with his own hands. He built the altar with reclaimed wood from an old fence that was going to be discarded. He polished each piece, fitting them together with the precision of an experienced carpenter. Nana Mildred sewed the tablecloths that would cover the tables, using fabric scraps she had saved for years for a special occasion. The entire community mobilized to help, each contributing what they could. But Eleanor did not give up on sabotaging the wedding until the last moment. 1 week before the ceremony, she called Maya saying Richard was very sick and urgently needed her. Maya rushed to the downtown penthouse, her heart tight with worry, only to find her stepfather perfectly fine, sitting in the living room with Eleanor. It was a trap. Richard gave a long speech about how Maya was throwing her future away, how she would regret it when she had children and couldn't give them what she had. Eleanor cried, saying she was only trying to protect her daughter from the suffering she herself went through when she was poor. Maya listened to everything in silence. When they finished, she stood up, looked at both of them, and said in a calm but firm voice that they had never gone hungry, never been mistreated, never truly suffered for being simple. The suffering Eleanor carried was self-imposed, born from the shame she herself had created. And as for Maya, she preferred an honest life with real difficulties to a comfortable but false life. Eleanor then did something Maya did not expect. She said that if the wedding was to happen, she would make a point of attending, not to support, but so that the entire family and friends could see with their own eyes the mistake Maya was making. She would invite all the cousins, uncles, acquaintances from local high society. They would make a striking presence, impossible to ignore. It was her way of making one last attempt to shame her daughter into backing out. Maya could have disinvited her mother right then. But something in her still hoped that, upon seeing Caleb and meeting his family, Eleanor would change her mind. It was a naive hope, she knew. But she was her mother. And as much as they were on opposite sides of that war, Maya couldn't sever the ties completely. The days leading up to the wedding were a frenzy of preparation. Caleb worked during the day and helped with the final details at night. Maya graded papers at school with her mind divided between her students and the approaching ceremony. Alice went to the property every day to help Nana Mildred with the food that would be served. They wanted to do everything traditionally, with recipes passed down through generations. The night before the wedding, Maya couldn't sleep. She stayed on the porch of the small house that Eleanor kept on the property, watching the stars. Caleb appeared unexpectedly, bringing a warm blanket because the night was cold. They sat together, and he held her hand without saying a word. They didn't need words. Each other's presence was enough. In the morning, Maya woke to Alice knocking on the door. Her aunt brought the dress they had chosen together, already ironed and fragrant. It was a simple but beautiful dress, with delicate lace that fell elegantly to her ankles. Alice helped her niece get ready, brushing her long hair and pinning it up in an unpretentious but charming bun. Maya wouldn't wear heavy makeup, just a soft lipstick and a light blush. She wanted to look like herself, not an edited version to meet others' expectations. Caleb, at Nana Mildred's house, was going through the same preparation ritual. He put on his grandfather's suit with the help of neighbors who had come to support him. Mr. Arthur, who would officiate the union, arrived early and spent the morning talking with the groom. The old man had known Caleb since he was a boy, had watched him grow up after the tragedy that took his parents. He saw in him a rare character, that combination of unshakable honesty and capacity to forgive that few people possess. Arthur told Caleb that morning about his own marriage 50 years earlier. It had also been simple, and had also faced judgment. His wife, June, came from a family a little better off than his, and the girl's parents hadn't approved of the union. But June was stubborn, just like Maya. The couple built a beautiful life together, raised 3 children who were now successful adults, not because they had money, but because they were good people. June had passed 2 years ago, but Arthur still talked to her every day, keeping alive the memory of the love they shared. The story calmed Caleb. It reminded him that what he and Maya were building was bigger than a day of ceremony, bigger than the opinions of people who didn't truly know them. It was about a whole lifetime of partnership, of facing difficulties together, of building something solid on a foundation of mutual respect. The first guests began to arrive around 2 in the afternoon. Caleb's neighbors, simple families who worked the land, arrived in groups, bringing contributions for the party. Mrs. Wilson brought her famous homemade cornbread. Mr. Ben showed up with a roast turkey that had been cooking all night. Each person carried not just food, but also genuine affection for the couple. Half an hour later, the imported cars began parking on the lawn. Eleanor stepped out of a black sedan, wearing an outfit that had cost more than Maya's entire wedding budget. Richard was at her side, equally well dressed, but it was Eleanor's eyes that drew attention. In them was a mixture of determination and something harder to define. Perhaps anticipated regret, perhaps just weariness. The cousins, uncles, and acquaintances Eleanor had brought disembarked as if arriving at a zoo. They observed everything with a curiosity mixed with superiority. The rented folding chairs, the altar made of reclaimed wood, the simple decorations made of wildflowers that Alice and Maya had picked the previous morning. Everything was analyzed, weighed, and found lacking according to the standards they carried. Brandon and Tiffany were the loudest from the start. He commented loudly on every detail he considered inadequate. She laughed exaggeratedly, making sure everyone around heard her opinion on how pathetic it all was. Other wealthy guests were more discreet, but no less judgmental. They whispered among themselves, exchanged meaningful looks, took photos that were clearly not meant as keepsakes, but to later share as examples of poor taste. Alice watched everything from her place among Caleb's neighbors. Her heart ached for her niece, but she also felt a growing anger toward her sister. Eleanor wasn't just allowing it, she was orchestrating it. Every look she exchanged with Richard, every knowing smile with the cousins, was a silent reinforcement that she was right to be ashamed of that event. Nana Mildred, seated in the front row on the simpler side of the makeshift aisle, kept her hands in her lap. Her arthritic fingers held an embroidered handkerchief that had belonged to her own mother. She had lived long enough to know that this kind of malice came from a place of deep pain. The people who mocked were not happy, no matter how much they pretended to be. But that didn't make the situation any less cruel for Caleb and Maya. The ceremony was scheduled to begin at 3 in the afternoon. At 2:45, Mr. Arthur took his place at the altar. Caleb walked there accompanied by Nana Mildred, in a gesture that made several of the humble guests wipe away tears. The grandmother held her grandson's arm with pride, and when she left him at the altar, she squeezed his hand briefly, a silent gesture of support and love. Maya was supposed to enter right after, but when the simple music started playing, a guitar played by one of Caleb's cousins, it wasn't her who appeared first. It was Honey, the calf, led by one of the neighbors. The idea was for the animal to represent the couple's commitment to build everything together, to care for and raise. Caleb even had a speech prepared to explain the symbolism, but the laughter that erupted when the calf appeared ruined any possibility of a meaningful moment. Brandon guffawed so loudly it scared some of the children present. Tiffany held onto his arm, laughing so hard that tears streamed from her heavy makeup. Other wealthy guests joined in, turning what should have been a touching moment into a collective joke. That's when Maya appeared. She was accompanied by Alice, who had insisted on being the one to lead her niece to the altar. The bride's simple dress swayed gently with her steps, and for a brief moment there was silence. Maya was beautiful, not in the artificial way seen in magazines, but in a natural and genuine way that touched those who had eyes to see. But the silence didn't last. The cousin Ashley, a 32-year-old woman who had been married 3 times and was on her 4th engagement, was the first to break it. Her comment about the thrift store dress was heard by all present, and that opened the floodgates to more comments, more laughter, more humiliation. Maya stopped halfway. Alice felt her niece tremble beside her. She looked at the young woman's face and saw tears forming. The aunt squeezed her arm, whispering that they could still leave, that they didn't have to go through with it. But Maya looked ahead to where Caleb waited for her at the altar. The groom's eyes met hers, and in that look was so much love, so much support, that Maya took a deep breath and kept walking. She reached the altar. Caleb took her hand. Mr. Arthur tried to begin the ceremony, but his voice was drowned out by more comments. Brandon was now talking about the old wooden altar. Another aunt commented on the flowers already wilting in the afternoon heat. A cousin took photo after photo, laughing with every click. That's when Honey, who was tied to a post a few meters away, caught the scent of something that frightened him. It wasn't the laughter itself, but a strong perfume one of the guests was wearing, something chemical that irritated the sensitive nostrils of the young animal. The calf began to pull on the rope, bleating loudly. The cousin who had brought him tried to calm him down, but Honey was growing increasingly agitated. Caleb noticed what was happening. He let go of Maya's hand and started walking toward the animal. But before he could get there, the rope snapped at the point where it was tied to the post. Someone had made an improper knot, and the force of the calf pulling was enough to undo it. Honey, now free and scared, bolted. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. The calf ran in a straight line right toward where the expensive drinks were set up. The table wasn't well balanced, resting on uneven ground. When Honey collided with one of the legs, everything came crashing down. Wine bottles rolled across the ground, champagne sprayed in all directions, crystal glasses shattered against the stones. But the worst was when the liquid hit the dresses of the women standing nearby. Tiffany got drenched in red wine on her expensive beige dress. Another cousin, Heather, who was wearing a white silk dress, was completely soaked in champagne. The women's screams echoed across the field, and the silence that followed was thick with tension. Caleb reached Honey quickly. The calf, frightened by the chaos he had caused, was trembling. Caleb held him firmly but gently, his large, calloused hands stroking the animal's neck as he whispered calming words. It didn't matter that everyone was watching, that Brandon was already shouting demands for payment, that the soaked women were crying in anger. Caleb focused only on calming the calf he had raised, whom he'd known since it was born small and weak, and whom he had cared for with dedication for months. Eleanor rose from her chair, her face twisted into an expression of bitter victory. This was exactly the kind of disaster she had expected, that she might have even subconsciously wished for. Richard was also standing, but his expression was different. There was something in his eyes, a growing discomfort with the whole situation. Brandon walked over to where Caleb was holding the calf. He was taller than the groom, and he used that to try to intimidate him. He demanded that Caleb pay not only for Tiffany's dress, but also for the expensive wines Eleanor had brought, the imported champagne, the broken crystal glasses. He spoke in thousands of dollars, an amount everyone there knew would take Caleb years to save. Caleb didn't answer. He kept his focus on Honey until the animal finally calmed down. Only then did he raise his eyes to Brandon. There was no fear there, nor anger, just a quiet firmness that was more intimidating than any shout. Caleb said, in a voice clear enough for everyone to hear, that the calf got scared because it wasn't used to so much noise and mockery. That animals sense when an environment is hostile, just like people do, and that he would take responsibility for the material damages, but that Brandon should take responsibility for the human damage he had caused. The response took everyone by surprise. Brandon opened his mouth to retort, but it was Nana Mildred who spoke first. The elderly lady rose from her chair, leaning on a simple cane her late husband had made for her decades ago. Her voice, when she spoke, trembled not from fear or weakness, but from a long-contained emotion. Mildred said she was 73 years old and had seen a lot in life. She'd seen rich people and poor people. She'd seen well-dressed people with bad hearts and people in rags with beautiful souls. But never, in all her years, had she witnessed such gratuitous cruelty as this. And looking directly at Eleanor, she asked if this was how the woman had raised her daughter, to find a good and honest man, and then allow him to be humiliated on what should have been the happiest day of their lives. The silence that followed was absolute. Eleanor, for the first time since she had arrived, seemed to have no answer. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Nana Mildred continued, saying she had known Eleanor's grandfather years ago when they both worked on a nearby farm. He was a good man, an honest worker who treated everyone with respect regardless of social standing, and that he must be turning in his grave to see what his granddaughter had become. It was the comment about the grandfather that broke something in Maya. She didn't know that Nana Mildred had known her great-grandfather. She looked at Caleb's grandmother in surprise, and then at her own mother, hoping Eleanor would deny it. But Eleanor did not deny it. She simply averted her eyes, silently confirming the truth. Maya felt as if the ground were disappearing beneath her feet. Her mother not only came from a simple family, but that family had a direct connection to Caleb's family. They weren't from different worlds, as Eleanor had always made it seem. They were from the same world, the same origins. The only difference lay in the choices they made about how to handle those origins. And it was at that moment, with Honey still trembling in Caleb's arms, with Nana Mildred standing defiantly against the hostility of the wealthy guests, with the ground covered in broken glass and spilled wine, with her simple but beautiful dress stained with champagne splashes, that Maya could no longer bear it. The tears she had been holding back finally fell, and she ran. Her bare feet, she had taken off her low heels to walk more comfortably to the altar, touched the grass dried by the strong sun. She ran without a specific direction, just wanting to get away from that scene, that disaster, that humiliation that seemed to have no end. She passed the small house where she had grown up, but didn't stop there. She continued to the most remote part of the property, where there was an old large tree that had always been her childhood refuge. She sat leaning against the thick trunk, finally letting the tears flow freely. She wasn't crying just about the wedding humiliation. She cried for the destroyed relationship with her mother, for the feeling of having failed to unite two worlds that perhaps could never coexist, for the pain of seeing Caleb treated that way. She cried for all the choices that had brought her there, and for the uncertainty about whether she had made the right ones. Back at the ceremony site, a heavy silence hung in the air. Caleb had handed Honey over to the care of a neighbor and was now standing at the altar, clearly torn between going after Maya or waiting. Aunt Alice approached him and placed a hand on his shoulder, telling him to go, that Maya needed him at that moment. But before Caleb could move, Eleanor stepped forward. Her voice, when she spoke, was different. Lower, weaker. She said she wanted to go, that she needed to talk to her daughter. Richard tried to hold her back, but Eleanor pulled away with a determination that surprised everyone. Aunt Alice looked at her sister with suspicion. She asked what exactly Eleanor planned to say to Maya, if she was coming to apologize or to cause more damage. Eleanor did not answer immediately. Her eyes swept over the wedding site, seeing for the first time, truly seeing, what had been prepared with so much care. The altar Caleb had built was simple, but every detail revealed care and attention. The flowers that were wilting weren't cheap. They were lovingly picked from the field itself. The tablecloths had delicate embroidery that took hours to make. Nana Mildred, still standing, watched Eleanor with her keen eyes. She had recognized Eleanor as soon as she stepped out of the car, even before knowing she was the bride's mother. She had known Eleanor's mother decades ago, and there was an undeniable resemblance. Back then, the two families were neighbors, working the same plantations during harvests. Their children played together when there was time for play. Nana Mildred remembered Eleanor as a girl, always serious, always with that distant look of someone dreaming of being elsewhere. Meanwhile, Maya tried to control her breathing under the tree. Her fingers dug into the dry earth, feeling the rough texture between them. It was a childish gesture, something she did as a little girl to calm herself. The earth had a distinctive smell, that country scent she associated with afternoons at her maternal grandmother's house, before the woman passed away when Maya was 12. That grandmother, Grace, was very much like Nana Mildred, a strong woman who raised children in difficult times, who worked hard her whole life, but never lost the ability to laugh, to love, to find beauty in simple things. Maya remembered how her grandmother would braid her hair on summer nights, telling stories about her own parents and grandparents, stories of overcoming, of true love, of values that mattered more than material possessions. But Eleanor never liked it when Grace told those stories. She would always interrupt, saying Maya had homework, or that it was already late. Now, Maya understood that her mother didn't want her daughter to become attached to those narratives, that version of the family. Eleanor was trying to build a new story, one where the simple past didn't exist. The sound of approaching footsteps made Maya look up. She expected to see Caleb, but it was Eleanor walking toward her. Her mother had taken off her high heels, and her thin stockings were already torn from walking on the uneven ground. The expensive dress was dusty at the hem, but it was her face that made Maya pause. Eleanor was crying. The mother sat on the ground beside her daughter, not caring about the expensive dress. For long minutes neither of them spoke. They just stayed there, side by side. Two women who shared blood and history, but had become almost strangers to each other. It was Eleanor who broke the silence. Her voice was hoarse, as if each word cost immense effort. She began to tell a story Maya had never heard, about a girl who grew up with real hunger, not the aesthetic hunger rich people pretend when they want to seem like they're dieting. Hunger of going to bed without dinner, because there was no food. Hunger of seeing younger siblings crying and being unable to do anything. Eleanor talked about going to school with patched clothes and being the target of jokes. How the teachers, even the well-meaning ones, treated her with a pity that was worse than contempt. How she swore to herself, still a child, that she would do whatever was necessary to get out of that situation. And when she met Richard Sterling, she saw the opportunity she had waited for her whole life. But here was the heart of the matter, Eleanor continued with a trembling voice. She didn't fall in love with Richard. She married the security he offered, the possibility of never being hungry again, of never being looked down on for being poor. And gradually, without realizing it, she began to despise everything that reminded her of where she came from, including, and especially, herself. Maya listened in silence, her tears now flowing for a different reason. She was beginning to understand though it still hurt deeply. Eleanor wasn't just trying to protect her from suffering. She was projecting her own traumas onto her daughter, her own shames and fears. Her mother continued, telling how every time she saw Maya getting close to something or someone simple, she felt a visceral panic, as if the past were a contagious disease that could infect her daughter if she wasn't careful. And when Maya announced her relationship with Caleb, it was as if Eleanor's worst nightmare was coming true. The daughter was choosing the life she had tried so hard to escape, but Eleanor admitted something that changed everything. She said that in the last few months, while watching Maya prepare for that wedding with so much dedication and love, something inside her began to change. She saw her daughter truly happy for the first time in years. Maya had been through previous relationships, always with young men from the social circle approved by Eleanor, and she had never shone in that way. With Caleb, she shone. And the hardest truth, Eleanor confessed, crying openly now, was that she herself had never experienced that happiness. She lived a comfortable life beside Richard, but not a happy life. She respected her husband, but did not love him. She had everything she thought she wanted, but felt a constant emptiness that no purchase, no social praise, no material achievement could fill. When she orchestrated that wedding humiliation, bringing all those mocking guests, Eleanor wasn't just trying to make Maya give up. She was testing the couple. She wanted to see if their love was strong enough to withstand the social storm, and deeply, secretly, a part of her hoped it was. Because if Maya could be happy in spite of everything, perhaps there was hope. Hope that the choices we make don't have to define who we are forever. Hope that it's never too late to change. Maya looked at her mother, seeing her truly for the first time, not as the cold, judgmental woman she seemed to have become, but as a deeply wounded person trying to survive the only way she knew how. It didn't justify the cruelty, but it explained it, and understanding is the first step to forgiveness. The two women embraced there under the old oak tree, crying together. Maya cried for the pain they both carried. Eleanor cried for all the lost years, for all the chances at true happiness she let pass by out of fear and pride. It was a moment of healing beginning, though both knew the road would be long. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. When they finally separated, Maya asked something that had been stuck in her throat for years. She asked if Eleanor still loved her real father, the simple man who left when Maya was a baby. The expression that crossed Eleanor's face answered before the words came. Yes, she loved him. She always had. But the man was too good for the cruel world, Eleanor explained. He worked honestly, but could never save enough money. And when the crisis came, when he lost his job and couldn't find another, the shame consumed him. He left not because he didn't love Maya or Eleanor, but because he thought they deserved someone better. Eleanor tried to find him years later, when Maya was already grown and she had married Richard. She wanted to say they had survived, that Maya was okay, but she discovered he had truly passed away a few years before, his heart weakened by a life of hard work, finally giving out. The news destroyed something in Eleanor. She never told Maya, carried that burden alone all these years. Now, sitting beside her daughter on the field floor, Eleanor cried for everything she had lost and everything she never had. Maya held her mother's hand, squeezing it tight, a gesture that said without words that they would find a way together. It wouldn't be easy, and the damage of the last years wouldn't disappear overnight. But it was a start. When they returned to the ceremony site, the sun was lower on the horizon, casting long shadows over the field. Caleb was sitting in one of the chairs, Nana Mildred at his side. Alice was talking with some neighbors, clearly trying to decide what to do. The wealthy guests were all gathered near the cars, as if waiting only for the right moment to leave. Caleb stood up when he saw Maya. She walked toward him, aware that everyone was watching. She took his hands in hers and said, in a voice clear enough for all to hear, that she wanted to continue. She wanted to get married right there, at that moment, with those people as witnesses. Not because the mocking guests deserved to be present, but because she wouldn't give them the power to destroy the most important day of their lives. Caleb looked into her eyes, seeking to be sure this was truly what Maya wanted. What he saw there was renewed determination and something more, a liberation. Maya was no longer torn between two worlds. She had chosen her own. Mr. Arthur approached, his cane tapping softly on the ground with each step. The old man had tears in his eyes, but they were tears of admiration. He said that in 50 years of officiating weddings, he had never seen a greater demonstration of true love than that one. Not just romantic love, but love for truth, for dignity, for the courage to be who one truly is. Eleanor watched from a distance, still processing the conversation she had had with her daughter. Richard approached her, and for the first time in years she allowed herself to hold her husband's hand, not out of social obligation, but out of a need for support. He seemed surprised by the gesture, but reciprocated, giving a gentle squeeze. The ceremony resumed, but now a different atmosphere hung over everyone. Caleb's neighbors, who had remained discreet and almost apologetic until then, began to sing. It was a traditional song from the region, passed down from generation to generation, that spoke of deep roots and love that withstands storms. The melody was simple but laden with genuine emotion. One of the wealthy cousins, Justin, who until then had only observed in silence without joining the mockery, but also without defending them, felt something break inside him upon hearing the singing. He had been married for 10 years to a woman his family approved of, but who had never made him feel what clearly existed between Maya and Caleb. His marriage was a convenient partnership, not a passion, and for the first time, he allowed himself to question if he had made the right choices. Caleb began to speak his vows. They weren't rehearsed words or taken from some manual. They were simple and true. He spoke about how Maya had entered his life like an unexpected storm, bringing color to days that were just work and responsibility. He spoke about how she had taught him that vulnerability wasn't weakness, that admitting he needed someone didn't make him less of a man. He spoke about the future they would build together, brick by brick, choice by choice, day after day. Maya, when it was her turn, was calm. The tears had dried, replaced by a clarity that came from having finally confronted the demons that haunted her. She spoke about how Caleb had taught her the meaning of integrity, how he never pretended to be someone he wasn't, never changed his behavior depending on who was watching. She spoke about how that inspired her to be braver, more true to herself. But it was what Maya said next that completely silenced even the most skeptical guests. She turned to the group of elegantly dressed people and said that she forgave them. She forgave the laughter, the cruel comments, the deliberate attempt to destroy something beautiful. Because she understood now that it didn't come from pure malice, but from people who had lost their connection to what truly mattered in life, and that she hoped, with a sincere heart, that one day everyone there would find the peace she had just found. The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones. It wasn't tense or uncomfortable. It was reflective. Tiffany, whose laugh had been the loudest and cruelest, looked at her wine-stained dress as if she were truly seeing it for the first time. It was just a dress, an expensive piece of fabric she would wear once and then store in the closet. But the humiliation it caused would remain forever in other people's memories. And for the first time in her life she felt true shame for her actions. The rings were exchanged. They were simple, plain gold bands, but they had been chosen with such care. Caleb placed the ring on Maya's finger with hands that trembled slightly, not from nervousness but from emotion. Maya did the same, and when their eyes met, the rest of the world disappeared for a moment. Mr. Arthur declared the two married, and a genuine applause echoed. It came mainly from Caleb's neighbors and friends, but some of the wealthy guests were also clapping. Justin was one of them, applauding forcefully as if he wanted to make up for the previous silence. Alice was crying openly, hugging Nana Mildred, who smiled with that smile of someone who knows everything will work out in the end. The kiss that sealed the marriage was long and tender. When they finally separated, Caleb held Maya's face in his hands and whispered something that only she could hear. Maya laughed, that light and genuine laugh he loved, and they walked hand in hand down the makeshift aisle. But it was when they started serving the food that something unexpected happened. The neighbors had prepared a feast with what they had. They weren't sophisticated or expensive dishes, but they were made with love and techniques passed down through generations. Mrs. Wilson brought her homemade cornbread, still warm and fragrant. Mr. Ben supervised the roast turkey that had been baking for hours, the skin crispy and the meat tender, falling apart with a fork. The wealthy guests, who had brought their own expensive drinks now destroyed in the incident with honey, hesitated. Some still maintained their pose of superiority, refusing to eat, but others, perhaps driven by hunger or curiosity, accepted the offered dishes. Brandon was one who initially refused, but Tiffany, surprisingly, accepted a piece of the cornbread. She bit into it, expecting something inferior to what she was used to, but the flavor caught her completely off guard. It was delicious. Not in the elaborate way of the expensive bakery cakes she bought, but in an honest and satisfying way that reminded her of childhood, before her father's money grew and the family moved to the capital. Tiffany was 32, but she seemed to have completely forgotten who she was before 20. She came from a middle-class family that became wealthy when her father closed a big contract in the construction sector. Overnight, they went from a comfortable but simple house to a downtown penthouse. And Tiffany, 18 at the time, quickly absorbed the mannerisms and attitudes of high society. She forgot old friends, changed social circles, and married Brandon at 25 because he came from a wealthy and traditional family. But biting into that simple cake, something in her broke. She remembered the grandmother who made cake every Saturday and whom she stopped visiting because the old lady's house was too small and simple for her new friends to see. Her grandmother had passed 2 years ago, and Tiffany hadn't even gone to the hospital in her final days, saying she had important social commitments. The shame she felt at that moment was so intense she had to sit down. Brandon, noticing something was wrong with his wife, approached. Tiffany began to cry, and they weren't delicate, contained tears. They were deep, ugly sobs, coming from a place of real regret. She told her husband about her grandmother, about how she regretted not being there at the end. And Brandon, for the first time since they married, truly listened to his wife. Not as background noise while checking his phone, but really listened. Caleb and Maya watched everything from afar. They had sat at a simple table with Nana Mildred, Alice, Mr. Arthur, and some of the closest neighbors. They ate slowly, savoring not just the food, but the moment. They were officially married. They had survived the storm, but the afternoon still held more surprises. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in spectacular shades of orange and purple, dark clouds began to form on the horizon. The weather, which had been hot and dry all day, changed abruptly. A strong breeze began to blow, carrying the unmistakable scent of rain. The wealthy guests ran to their cars, but what they hadn't considered was where they were parked. The lawn, seemingly firm during the day, began to soften with the first falling raindrops. The heavy imported cars with smooth city tires got stuck almost immediately when they tried to leave. Brandon spun the wheel of his expensive sedan, making the tires spin uselessly in the forming mud. Other guests faced the same problem. The access road to the property, a dirt track that worked perfectly in dry weather, quickly turned into an impassable quagmire. Eleanor, watching everything from inside Richard's car, which was also stuck, felt something akin to cosmic irony. She had spent months planning how to humiliate the couple, and now the universe seemed to be turning the tables. She and the other wealthy guests were literally stuck there, dependent on the very people they had mocked. The rain intensified rapidly. It wasn't a gentle drizzle, but a true storm, with lightning illuminating the sky and thunder echoing. Caleb, without hesitation, began organizing shelter for everyone. He opened the small house where he lived with Nana Mildred, which had only 3 rooms but was solid and safe. He asked the neighbors to do the same in their nearby properties. The soaked wealthy guests, with no choice, accepted the help. Eleanor entered Caleb and Maya's house for the first time. The interior was even simpler than the exterior suggested. Old but well-kept furniture, walls that needed a new coat of paint, floorboards worn by time. But it was clean, organized, and there was a warmth that didn't come from luxury, but from being a true home. Nana Mildred, despite the arthritis that made her movements difficult, began making coffee on an old wood-burning stove. Maya helped her, explaining to her newly acquired grandmother that this would be the first of many times they would work together in that kitchen. The old lady smiled, her eyes shining with genuine joy. Caleb distributed blankets that Nana Mildred kept in a wooden chest. They were old quilts, some patched, but warm and functional. He offered them to the guests shivering in their expensive but thin clothes, designed for climate-controlled environments, not real storms. It was during these forced hours of close proximity that the masks began to fall more deeply. Heather, the cousin who had soaked herself in champagne, sat in a corner of the small living room and began to talk. Perhaps it was the shock of the situation, or perhaps it was the feeling that nothing else mattered at that moment, but she confessed she was exhausted. Heather was 38 and had been married for 15 years to a successful businessman. They lived in a huge house in the best part of town, had 3 imported cars, traveled abroad twice a year. But they hadn't touched each other in months. They only talked about practical things, bills, social engagements, the children's schedules. Her husband was having an affair that she pretended not to know about, and she herself had considered starting one, not out of desire, but out of loneliness. Heather's confession opened the floodgates for others. An uncle admitted he was bankrupt, but hadn't told anyone in the family because the shame was too great. He was keeping up appearances through ever larger loans, knowing everything would soon collapse. Another cousin confessed that he hated the corporate job he had, but didn't know how to do anything else and was afraid to start over. Eleanor listened to all these confessions in silence. She realized she wasn't alone. Everyone there, with their expensive clothes and imported cars, carried their own emptiness and fears. The difference was they spent so much time keeping up appearances that they never truly talked about anything. Maya Collins moved between the groups, offering coffee, chatting. She didn't judge anyone, she just listened, and that in itself was revolutionary for people accustomed to being heard only superficially, always with judgment waiting between the lines. Caleb Miller, meanwhile, checked the conditions outside. The storm was strong but was starting to pass. He knew that weather well. He knew that in a few hours the worst would be over, but that the road would take at least until the next morning to be passable again. He communicated this to the guests, who received the news with mixed reactions. Some became visibly distressed. Brandon had important meetings the next day. Heather needed to pick up her children from the private school they attended. But there was nothing to do but accept the situation. It was Alice who suggested they use that time productively. She proposed they share stories, that they really talk, something that rarely happened in their usual social gatherings. The suggestion was met with initial hesitation, but the alternative was sitting in uncomfortable silence for hours. Mr. Arthur was the first to speak. He told about his married life with June, about the challenges they faced. There were years when they barely had anything to eat, but they always had each other. He spoke with a serenity and contentment that were palpable. He didn't lament what he didn't have. He celebrated what he had lived. Nana Mildred shared her own story. She talked about raising 5 children alone after her husband left, about working 3 jobs at once to make sure everyone ate. About nights, she went to bed hungry so her children could eat, but she also talked about the joys. The pride of seeing each child become a good and honest person. The grandchildren who visited and filled the house with laughter. The community that always supported her in the hardest moments. As the stories were shared, something remarkable happened. The wealthy guests began to see Nana Mildred, Mr. Arthur, Alice and the others, not as inferior people to be looked down upon, but as individuals with full and meaningful lives. Lives that, in many ways, were richer than their own. Justin, the cousin who had begun to question his own choices during the ceremony, asked to speak. His voice trembled when he admitted he didn't love his wife. He never had. He married her because she came from the right family, had the right education, fit perfectly into the life plan his parents had drawn up for him. But at 35, he felt he had wasted his entire life living to please others. His wife, Kimberly, was present, but had stayed in another room. When she heard the confession through the thin wall, her first reaction was anger. But then she realized she had never loved him either. She had also married for convenience, for security, for following the expected script. The two had built such an elaborate joint lie that perhaps they had believed it until that moment of forced truth. Richard Sterling, Maya's stepfather, watched everything with a thoughtful expression. He was a 58-year-old man who had built his empire through hard work and calculated decisions. But listening to all those confessions, he began to question what he had really built. He had money, professional success, respect in the business community. But did he have happiness? Did he have true connections? Did he have peace? He looked at Eleanor, his wife of 20 years, and truly saw her for the first time in a long while. He saw not the elegant woman who presided over social dinners and organized charity events. He saw the tired and wounded person who had been rejected by her own daughter because she was incapable of offering genuine love. Richard excused himself and asked Eleanor to speak privately. They went to the small room that Nana Mildred had offered, and for the first time in years they had a real conversation. Not about finances or social engagements, but about emotions, fears, regrets. Richard confessed that he had known about Eleanor's first husband from the beginning. He knew she had not forgotten him, that perhaps she had never loved him in the same way, and he said that had hurt more than she could imagine. But he also confessed that he had settled into that situation because it was easier than taking emotional risks. He had married Eleanor because she was beautiful, educated enough, and clearly interested in the security he offered. He didn't need to fear rejection because he had never offered his true heart. Eleanor in turn admitted for the first time aloud that she had been unfair to him. Richard was a good man. He wasn't exciting or passionate, but he was reliable, respectful, and had treated her well all these years, and she had treated him as a means to an end, never as a whole person with his own feelings and needs. The conversation was difficult and painful. Tears were shed, old resentments were laid bare. But in the end, they decided something important. They would really try. Not just continue as they were, but truly try to build something authentic between them. Perhaps they would never have the burning passion of young lovers, but they could have true companionship, mutual respect, and who knows, a more mature form of love. When they returned to the living room, they found a different scene. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and fresh. People were still talking, but now there was laughter mixed with the serious stories. Someone had found an old guitar in one of the rooms, and one of Caleb's neighbors was playing old songs that everyone knew. Maya and Caleb were sitting together, their first night as a married couple being shared with an unlikely group of people. But there was something beautiful in that, a feeling that barriers were falling, that people were allowing themselves to be vulnerable and true. Tiffany approached Maya. Her words came out rushed, urgent. She apologized for everything. For the cruel laughs, for the mean comments, for filming to ridicule. She said she had no excuse for her behavior, but that she was deeply sorry. And she offered something unusual. She invited Maya and Caleb to her house the following week, not for an elaborate social party, but for a real conversation. She wanted to truly get to know them. Maya accepted the invitation, surprising herself. It would be easy to hold a grudge, to keep her distance. But if she was asking people to accept her as she was, she needed to do the same. Give people the chance to grow and change. The night wore on. Some people slept in makeshift chairs. Others spread out among the small rooms, sharing spaces. There was no privacy or comfort, but there was something more valuable. There was humanity. There was real connection between people who, just a few hours before, barely saw each other as complete human beings. When dawn arrived, illuminating the rain-washed fields, people began to stir. The road was still wet, but Caleb and some neighbors went to check and declared it passable with care. The stuck cars would need help getting out, but that wasn't a problem. There were tractors available. There was a willing workforce to help. The process of freeing each car was long. Each imported vehicle needed to be carefully pulled from the mud by old but functional tractors. And there was an irony in that which did not go unnoticed by anyone. The same men whose work and equipment had been scorned hours before were now essential for the wealthy guests to return to their lives. Brandon was one of the last to be freed. His expensive sedan had gotten stuck deeper than the others. While he waited, he talked with Caleb. It was a surprising conversation. Brandon asked about life in the country, about working the land, about the satisfaction it brought. He didn't ask in a condescending way. but with genuine curiosity. Caleb answered honestly. He spoke about the challenges, about how the work was hard and the financial return often meager, but he also spoke about the freedom of working under the sun, of seeing the direct result of his effort, of being part of a community where people truly cared for one another. It wasn't an easy life, but it was an honest one. Brandon revealed something that surprised Caleb. He said he had grown up in the countryside, in a small town not so different from this one. His father was a shopkeeper, not rich but comfortable. But Brandon moved to the capital at 18, determined to make his fortune. And he succeeded. He built a business consulting firm that earned millions. But in the process, he cut all ties with his origins. He hadn't visited his hometown in 15 years. He barely spoke with his elderly father, claiming he was always too busy. There was something in the way Brandon told this that sounded familiar to Caleb. It was the same pain he saw in Eleanor, the same regret of having traded substance for appearance. Caleb didn't judge. He only suggested that perhaps it was never too late to reconnect, that his father would probably like to see him, regardless of how much time had passed. Brandon was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. He said his father called once a week, always at the same time, always trying to talk. And Brandon always cut the conversation short, claiming he had meetings or important appointments. The last call had been 3 days ago. Brandon had promised to call back but didn't. And now, after spending the night in that simple house seeing what truly mattered, the shame was almost unbearable. Caleb put a hand on Brandon's shoulder. He didn't say it was okay, because it wasn't. But he said what mattered was what he did from there on. That each day was a new chance to make better choices. When all the cars were finally free and ready to leave, something unexpected happened. No one left immediately. The wealthy guests, dirty with mud, tired, with expensive clothes ruined, hesitated. Some looked for Maya and Caleb to say a proper goodbye. Others talked with Nana Mildred, thanking her for the hospitality. Some exchanged phone numbers with the neighbors, promising to keep in touch. Eleanor was one of the last to leave. She sought out Maya and held her daughter's hands. There were no adequate words for everything that needed to be said, but she promised to try. She promised to work on herself, on her fears and shames. She didn't guarantee it would be easy or quick, but she guaranteed she would try. And for the first time in years, Maya believed her mother. Richard shook Caleb's hand with firmness and genuine respect. He offered help if the couple needed it, not in a condescending way, but as he would for an equal. Caleb thanked him, and although he didn't plan to accept the help financially, he appreciated the gesture and what it represented. Alice stayed last, helping to clean the house after everyone had left. Maya hugged her tightly, thanking her for everything, for having been the only one to support her from the beginning, for having had the courage to confront Eleanor when necessary, for being the bridge between two worlds that seemed irreconcilable. When they were finally alone, Caleb, Maya, and Nana Mildred, they sat on the small porch. The sun was high now, drying the wet earth. The field shone with that special brightness that comes after the rain, and for the first time since the beginning of that whole process, the three of them laughed. They laughed at the absurdity of it all, at the chaos of the calf, at the timely storm, at the nighttime confessions. They laughed with the relief of having survived. But the wedding hadn't ended there. In the following weeks, unexpected events began to unfold. Tiffany kept her promise and invited Maya and Caleb over for dinner, but it wasn't the elaborate dinner Maya had feared. It was a simple meal, prepared by Tiffany herself with help from Brandon, who revealed a talent for cooking he had kept hidden, thinking it wasn't suitable for someone in his position. During dinner, Tiffany shared more about her late grandmother. She showed old photos, shared stories. Maya listened attentively, offering not judgment, but empathy. At the end of the evening, Tiffany asked if Maya would teach her to cook some of the traditional recipes that had been served at the wedding. She wanted to reconnect with that part of herself she had abandoned. Justin left his wife. It wasn't an easy or quick decision. They talked for weeks, tried counseling, but in the end they recognized they were trapped in an unsustainable lie. The separation was amicable, and for the first time in their lives they both felt a weight lifted from their shoulders. Kimberly began studying fine arts, something she had always wanted, but was considered unsuitable for someone of her class. Justin took a sabbatical from work to travel, not to expensive tourist destinations, but to small towns where he could work with his hands and rediscover who he was beyond business. Brandon visited his father. The conversation was difficult at first, full of heavy silences and old hurts. But his father, a 72-year-old man with fragile health, was so grateful for the visit that he cried. Brandon spent a week in his hometown, helping his father with small repairs around the house, talking about nothing and everything. When he returned to the city, something in him had changed. He began to reduce his workload, to prioritize different things. Eleanor started therapy. It was a difficult decision for someone who had spent her entire life building walls around her emotions. But in the weekly sessions, she began to unpack decades of self-inflicted shame, of choices based on fear, of denied love. The progress was slow, but it was real. Richard, in turn, began participating in a group of local business people who worked with small farmers. He offered free consulting on management and finances, helping rural families improve their operations without losing their identity or values. It was work that brought no financial return, but it brought something his business empire never had: genuine purpose. Maya continued teaching, but now with a renewed passion. She began to incorporate stories about her own roots into her lessons, teaching students about the importance of knowing and honoring where they came from. Some parents complained, saying it wasn't in the official curriculum, but others thanked her, saying their children were learning lessons about humanity that no textbook could teach. Caleb expanded his work. With help from some of the neighbors, he started a small, sustainable farming project. They taught techniques to local youth who wanted to work the land but didn't know where to start. They didn't earn much from it, but the satisfaction of seeing a new generation learning to value honest work was immeasurable. Nana Mildred, despite her advanced age, became a sort of unofficial matriarch of the expanded community. People from all walks of life began visiting her, seeking her wisdom. She welcomed everyone with the same simple hospitality, offering coffee and listening with an attentiveness that only comes from having lived long enough to understand that every human story is important. Mr. Arthur, inspired by the events of the wedding, began documenting stories from the region. He went from house to house with an old tape recorder, asking the elders to share their memories. He wanted to preserve that knowledge before it was lost. The project grew beyond what he had imagined, and eventually a nearby university became interested, offering help to turn the recordings into a permanent historical archive. But not everything was celebration and growth. There were challenges. Brandon's mother suffered a severe heart attack 3 months after the wedding. The doctors said the stress of years hiding financial problems had taken its toll. The revelation forced the family to confront issues they had been avoiding for years. But instead of disintegrating under the pressure, they came together. Brandon took on his father's debts, restructuring them into manageable payments. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Heather faced a personal crisis when she finally confronted her husband about the extramarital affair. The conversation was brutal and revealing. The husband did not deny it, but he also did not apologize in a way that seemed sincere. Heather had to make the most difficult decision of her life, to stay and try to rebuild something that may have never truly existed, or to leave and face life alone for the first time since she was 20. She chose to leave. The divorce process was complicated and painful, but Heather discovered a strength she didn't know she possessed. Maya and Caleb faced their own challenges. The first year of marriage is difficult for any couple, but especially for them coming from such different realities. There were moments of frustration when Caleb would come home exhausted from work and had no energy for the long conversations Maya needed. There was tension when Maya spent money on books or school supplies, and Caleb worried about their tight finances. But they had promised each other honesty above all else. So they talked. Fights happened. Voices were raised. Sometimes one of them would leave slamming the door. But they always came back. They always sat down to really talk, to listen, not just to reply, but to understand. And little by little, they were building not just a marriage, but a true partnership. Honey, the calf that had caused so much chaos, grew strong and healthy. He became the first of a small herd that Caleb began raising with techniques learned from the older neighbors. Each animal had a name and received individualized care. It wasn't an operation large enough to make them rich, but it was enough to live with dignity and still have time for the things that truly mattered. Eleanor began visiting Maya regularly. At first, the visits were tense and short. They talked about superficial things, avoiding topics that could reopen wounds. But gradually, as Eleanor worked on her therapy and Maya matured in her marriage, the conversations deepened. They began to rebuild not just a mother-daughter relationship, but a true friendship. In a particularly significant moment, 6 months after the wedding, Eleanor asked to see the house where Maya and Caleb lived. Not to judge or criticize, but because she genuinely wanted to understand the life her daughter had chosen. Maya was nervous but agreed. When Eleanor entered the small house, her eyes took in every detail: the simple but well-kept furniture, the walls where Maya had begun hanging photos and paintings made by students, the small kitchen where Nana Mildred had taught Maya to make the family's traditional dishes, the modest bedroom with a bed that Caleb had built with his own hands, using reclaimed wood. Eleanor stood in silence for a long moment. So, to Maya's surprise, she smiled. Not a bitter or forced smile, but a genuine one. She said the house reminded her of the first home she lived in with her parents before money and ambition changed everything, and that she finally understood why Maya had chosen that. It wasn't about poverty versus wealth. It was about authenticity versus falseness. Richard continued his work with the local farmers, but something unexpected happened. One of the young men he was mentoring presented an innovative idea for an agricultural cooperative. Richard saw real potential there, not just to help one person, but to transform the entire region. He began investing significant time and resources into the project. The cooperative grew beyond expectations. Small farmers who once barely managed to survive began to thrive. They didn't become rich, but they achieved financial security and dignity. And Richard discovered that this project, born not from profit ambition but from a genuine desire to help, brought more satisfaction than all his other business ventures combined. Tiffany's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic of all. She not only learned to cook with Maya, but began to question every aspect of her life. She realized she had no true friendships, only acquaintances who maintained closeness for social interest. She decided to change that. She began volunteering at a senior support home, where she met people who had fascinating stories, but no one to listen to them. One of the elderly women Tiffany met, Mrs. Dorothy, was 93 years old and had an incredibly preserved memory. She told stories from when she was young, of a very different Brazil, of hardships Tiffany could barely imagine, but also of simple joys, of true love, of united communities. Tiffany began visiting Mrs. Dorothy 3 times a week, not out of obligation, but because she genuinely enjoyed the old lady's company. Brandon, initially skeptical about Tiffany's changes, began to notice the difference in her. His wife seemed lighter, more genuine. She laughed more, and they weren't forced or performative laughs, but real expressions of joy. He began to accompany her on visits to the support home, and there he met Mr. Frank, an 86-year-old man who had been a mechanic his whole life. Mr. Frank had incredible stories about old cars, about fixing things when there were no replacement parts and you had to improvise. Brandon, who had always considered manual labor as something inferior, began to see the art and intelligence involved. He began spending his Saturday afternoons in the small workshop that Mr. Frank kept on the grounds of the support home, learning to work with his hands. 1 year after the tumultuous marriage, Maya discovered she was pregnant. The news brought joy mixed with fear. Finances were still tight. The house was small. There were 1,000 practical reasons to be afraid. But when Caleb placed his hand on Maya's still flat belly and smiled in that way that lit up his whole eyes, she knew they would be okay. Eleanor received the news of the pregnancy with complex emotions. She would be a grandmother. But instead of the simple joy she should feel, there was also fear. Fear of repeating the mistakes she made as a mother. Fear that the granddaughter or grandson would grow up despising her, as Maya had for so long. She shared these fears with Richard, in one of the honest conversations they now had regularly. Richard suggested something surprising. He said that perhaps they should sell the penthouse. It was too big for just the two of them, and the money could be invested in ways that really mattered. It took Eleanor weeks to process the idea. The penthouse had been her trophy, proof that she had won in life, but it was also a symbol of everything that had gone wrong, of distorted values and misplaced priorities. Finally, Eleanor agreed. They sold the penthouse and bought a more modest house in the same rural area where Caleb and Maya lived. Not as simple as the young couple's home, but not overtly large either. It was a house for living, not for impressing. The move was more difficult than Eleanor had anticipated. Going from 30 rooms to 6 was a physical adjustment, but the psychological adjustment was even greater. It meant publicly admitting that she was changing, that the values she had professed for decades were wrong. It meant facing comments from old acquaintances about how she was declining. But something interesting happened. As Eleanor detached from material things, she discovered space for more meaningful things. She started attending the local community meetings. She volunteered to help Nana Mildred with the oral history project that Mr. Arthur had started. And for the first time in decades, she felt useful in a way that truly mattered. Maya's pregnancy progressed. There was morning sickness that seemed to last all day. There were moments of panic when the baby didn't move for a few hours, and Maya would rush to the small local health clinic. There were nights when Caleb held her hair while she vomited, whispering words of encouragement. Nana Mildred, who had helped bring dozens of babies into the world over her lifetime, had become Maya's confidant. She taught the young woman about the body's signals, about how to prepare for childbirth, about the first months of caring for a newborn. There was no judgment about Maya's fear or uncertainty, only constant support and shared wisdom. Aunt Alice sewed a complete layette for the baby. Each piece was handmade from simple but soft fabrics. There were no designer labels or fashionable designs, but there was something infinitely more valuable. Every stitch carried love. Each piece was a silent prayer for the health and happiness of the baby to come. At 7 months pregnant, Maya had her baby shower. Not an elaborate party in a rented hall, but a gathering at Aunt Alice's house with the women of the community. Eleanor was invited and, after hesitation, attended. She sat in a circle of simple women who shared stories of their own births, offered practical advice, and laughed at memories of incorrectly changed diapers and sleepless nights. One of the neighbors, Mrs. Lucia, a 58-year-old who had raised 8 children, held Maya's hands and said something that would be etched in the young mother's memory. She said that raising a child didn't require money or expensive things. It required presence, patience, and unconditional love. It required being willing to put the child's needs before your own, but also teaching the child about boundaries and respect, and that Maya and Caleb, with their honesty and dedication to each other, would be wonderful parents. Eleanor, hearing that, felt tears stream down her face. She realized she had never given Maya that true presence. She was always too busy keeping up appearances, attending social events, making sure they were impressing the right people. She had done what she thought was best, but not what was truly needed. When the baby was finally born, a healthy girl weighing 7 pounds, it was a community celebration. Neighbors arrived with food, offers of help, practical gifts like cloth diapers and handmade blankets. Caleb and Maya's small house was full of people wanting to meet the newborn. They named her Grace, after Maya's grandmother. Eleanor, when she learned the name, cried. It was an acknowledgement of the woman she had been and that she had tried to erase. It was Maya saying she forgave, that she honored the family roots regardless of the shame Eleanor had felt for so many years. The first months with the baby were challenging, as they are for all new parents. Sleepless nights, constant worries, adjustments to the routine, but they also brought unexpected joys. Caleb revealed himself to be an extremely attentive father, waking in the middle of the night to change diapers without complaint, singing lullabies with his deep and gentle voice. Maya discovered she loved motherhood more than she had ever imagined possible. There were moments of extreme exhaustion and doubts about whether she was doing everything right, but when she held Grace in her arms and saw her daughter's eyes fixed on hers with that absolute trust babies have, she felt nothing else mattered. Eleanor visited regularly. But now her visits were different. She didn't come to judge or criticize. She came to help in practical ways. She washed dishes, folded laundry, held the baby so Maya could take a long shower. She was a present grandmother, in a way she had never been a present mother. Richard fell in love with his granddaughter in a way that surprised everyone, including himself. He had never been close to his own children when they were young, always too busy building his empire. But with Grace, he allowed himself to be silly and affectionate in a way he never had before. He arrived for visits with simple but carefully chosen toys, spent hours just holding the baby and humming softly. Tiffany and Brandon also visited frequently. Watching Maya and Caleb with the baby awakened in them a desire they had suppressed for years. They had decided not to have children early in their marriage, claiming they were too focused on careers. But now they questioned whether that decision had truly been theirs, or just another manifestation of trying to fit into social molds that suffocated them. They began conversations about possibly adopting. Not a baby, but an older child from the foster system who was typically overlooked by families wanting newborns. It would be a different journey, full of its own challenges. But for the first time in years, Tiffany felt excited about something real in her life. Justin, after his sabbatical year, returned to the city, but he didn't go back to the same corporate job. He opened a small woodworking shop, using skills he had learned during his travels. He made custom furniture, unique pieces that took time and care. He earned a fraction of what he had before, but for the first time in his adult life, he woke up excited to go to work. Heather, 2 years after her separation, began a relationship with a music teacher she met at the gym they both attended. He didn't have the money or social status her ex-husband possessed, but he had something infinitely more valuable: the ability to make her laugh genuinely, to truly listen to her, to accept her with all her flaws and insecurities. At 40, Heather was experiencing for the first time what it was like to be in a relationship based on real love and not convenience. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out, now continuing. The agricultural cooperative that Richard had helped establish was thriving beyond all expectations. Small farmers who once competed against each other discovered that cooperation was more profitable than competition. They began sharing equipment, knowledge, even labor during harvest seasons. The region began gaining a reputation for quality products, and buyers from larger cities began seeking them out directly. Caleb became an important part of this cooperative. His honesty and hard work were known and respected. He wasn't the most eloquent or formally educated, but when he spoke, people listened. There was a practical wisdom in him that came from years working directly with the land, understanding its rhythms and needs. Maya continued teaching, but now with Grace often present. The school where she worked allowed her to bring the baby, and the students loved it. There was something beautiful about learning history or math with a baby making little noises in the background. It made everything more human, less mechanical. One afternoon, 3 years after the tumultuous wedding that changed so many lives, Maya received an unexpected call. It was from a documentary producer who had heard about the wedding story through Tiffany, who kept a modest blog where she wrote about her journey of personal rediscovery. The producer wanted to document not just that chaotic day, but the transformations it triggered in so many lives. Maya discussed it with Caleb. He was hesitant about public exposure. He valued privacy and didn't like the idea of their lives becoming entertainment. But Maya saw an opportunity. If they shared their story honestly, perhaps it could help other people stuck in similar situations. People living false lives out of fear of judgment. People divided between worlds as she had been. After several conversations, they decided to participate, but with clear conditions. The story would be told honestly, including the difficult and imperfect parts. It wouldn't be edited to create artificial drama or make anyone look better or worse than they were. It would be authentic, or it wouldn't happen at all. The producer agreed. During the following months, the crew documented the couple's life and interviewed all the key people involved in that transformative afternoon. Eleanor spoke with brutal honesty about her shame and healing journey. Richard shared about finding purpose late in life. Tiffany, Brandon, Justin, Heather all offered their perspectives. Nana Mildred, now 76 and physically more frail, was perhaps the most impactful interview. She spoke with that wisdom that only comes from living long and paying attention, about how society often values the wrong things, about how true love and genuine connections are rarer and more precious than any material possession, about how it's never too late to change and grow. The documentary was released on a modest streaming platform. It didn't have the budget or publicity of big productions, but something in it resonated deeply with people. It began to be shared organically, with viewers tagging friends and family, saying they needed to watch it. The reactions varied. Some watched it and felt inspired to make changes in their own lives. Others were skeptical, thinking it was all staged or exaggerated. But what was undeniable was that the story sparked conversations. Conversations about values, about what really matters in life, about the price of keeping up appearances. For Maya and Caleb, the exposure brought unexpected challenges. They began receiving messages from strangers. Some were positive and encouraging. Others were harsh criticism from people who judged them for choices they made or how they handled certain situations. Caleb, in particular, struggled with this. He wasn't prepared for strangers giving opinions about his life. There was a period of a few weeks when he regretted agreeing to the documentary. He felt they had sold their privacy, turned intimate moments into public spectacle. Maya also dealt with the guilt of having convinced Caleb to participate. Their discussions on the topic became tense between them. It was Nana Mildred who finally brought perspective. One afternoon, when Caleb was venting about the negative messages he'd received, she asked how many positive messages he had received. Caleb counted. There were 23 people saying the story had inspired them to make significant changes in their lives. Nana Mildred then asked if those 23 transformed lives weren't worth the discomfort of the criticism. The question made Caleb stop and really think. One of the messages was from a 46-year-old woman who had been stuck in an unhappy marriage for 20 years. After watching the documentary, he had finally found the courage to ask for a divorce. Another was about a 24-year-old who was pursuing a career he hated just to please his parents. He had decided to change his major, even knowing it would disappoint his family. Caleb realized that Nana Mildred was right. The discomfort he felt was temporary and manageable, but the positive impact on these people's lives could last forever. He talked to Maya, apologized for being resistant, and they both decided to focus on the positive stories instead of the criticism. But life continued with its own challenges, regardless of the documentary. Grace turned 3 and began to show a strong, independent personality. She was as stubborn as her father and as questioning as her mother. There were mornings when getting the child dressed for school became a battle of wills that left Maya exhausted before the day even began. Caleb had his own challenges with work. There was a severe drought that lasted 5 months, devastating the crops of the entire region. The small herd he had raised survived, but only because he and Maya cut expenses on everything else to ensure feed and water for the animals. There were weeks when they ate as little as possible so that Grace and the animals wouldn't go without. It was during this difficult time that Eleanor and Richard revealed themselves in a surprising way. They offered financial help, but not in the condescending way Eleanor would have done years before. They offered it as family offers to family, without expecting excessive gratitude or subordination. Caleb initially refused, his pride wounded by the idea of accepting money from someone who had humiliated him in the past. But Maya talked to him one particularly difficult night, when they were both exhausted and worried. She said that accepting help wasn't weakness, that true family means being there for each other in tough times, and that Eleanor had changed, was genuinely trying to be different. Denying her the chance to help would be denying her growth. Caleb agreed, though it cost him his pride. They accepted the loan not as a gift, but as a real loan they would pay back when things improved. Eleanor insisted there was no hurry, but Caleb made a point of establishing clear terms. It was important to him to maintain that sense of dignity and autonomy. The drought eventually ended, brought by storms that were almost as devastating as the lack of rain. Floods destroyed parts of the access road, isolating the community for days. But the same community Eleanor had scorned years before proved incredibly resilient. Neighbors shared what they had. Those with generators lent them to those who needed to keep food refrigerated. Tools, labor, even space in homes were offered freely. Eleanor witnessed all this and finally fully understood what she had lost by turning her back on her roots. That community had something her wealthy social circle never had: true solidarity. When someone fell, others lifted them up. Not out of obligation or to impress, but because they genuinely cared. Richard was equally impressed. He saw men working to exhaustion to fix the road, not because they would be paid, but because everyone depended on it. He saw women organizing community kitchens to ensure no one went hungry during the isolation. He saw elderly people looking after groups of children so parents could work on the necessary repairs. Compared to this, his elaborate social dinners and theatrical charity events seemed empty and performative. Richard began to question not just his social life, but the entire structure of how he lived and worked. He began to think about downsizing not just the house, but his businesses. Maybe he didn't need an empire. Perhaps something smaller but more meaningful would be better. Meanwhile, Tiffany and Brandon had indeed adopted a child. Tyler was 9 years old when he arrived, an age many considered too difficult. The boy came from a complicated situation, having been through 3 different foster homes. He had trust issues, anger outbursts, nights of nightmares. The first months were extremely challenging. There were moments when Tiffany wondered if they had made a mistake, if they weren't prepared for it. Brandon also had doubts, especially when Tyler destroyed an expensive vase in a fit of rage or when the school called reporting aggressive behavior. But they had undergone extensive therapy before the adoption, understanding that the journey would be difficult. What kept them steady was the support of the extended community that had formed after that transformative wedding. Maya visited regularly, talked to Tyler about simple things without pressure or judgment. Caleb took the boy to help with the animals, teaching him responsibility in a practical way. Nana Mildred told stories to the boy, sharing wisdom in a way that didn't feel like a sermon. Slowly, Tyler began to change. The anger outbursts became less frequent. The nightmares continued, but were more spaced out. And in a moment, Tiffany would hold on to forever. 3 months after the adoption, Tyler called her mum for the first time. It wasn't on a special occasion or a planned moment. It was simply when asking her to pass the ketchup at dinner. "Mum, can you pass the ketchup?" Tiffany cried so hard, she worried Tyler until she explained they were good tears. Justin had found his own form of happiness in woodworking. His work had begun to gain recognition, not through marketing or social connections, but through pure quality. Each piece was unique, made with attention to detail that mass-produced furniture could never have. He wasn't rich, but he was stable, and more importantly, he was happy. He met someone unexpectedly. Sarah was a carpenter who did renovation and remodeling work. They met when she hired Justin to make custom cabinets for a kitchen she was renovating. Sarah was 39, divorced for 6 years, and had a 12-year-old daughter. She didn't come from Justin's world, didn't wear designer clothes or talk about investments, but she had hands calloused from honest work and a laugh that lit up the whole workshop. The romance developed slowly. Justin was cautious, still processing the end of his previous marriage and everything he had learned about himself since then. Sarah was also careful, protecting not only her own heart but also the heart of her daughter. But there was a genuine connection there, built on shared values and mutual respect. Heather had also found peace in her new relationship. Stephen, the music teacher, was different from any man she had met before. He played guitar at a local bar on Fridays to supplement his income. He wore clothes bought from thrift stores. He drove a 15-year-old car. But he had a beautiful soul and a generous heart. Stephen had been married before and lost his wife in an accident a few years back. The pain was still there, Heather could tell. He spoke about his late wife with a love that was both beautiful and difficult to witness. Heather had to make peace with the fact that she would never be Stephen's first love, that she would always share his heart with the memory of someone she would never know. But Stephen loved Heather completely, and in the present. He didn't compare, didn't make her feel like she was second best. He was just honest about his past and the scars he carried. Heather appreciated that honesty. It was very different from her first marriage, where lies and omissions were the norm. Mr. Arthur, now 73 years old, continued his project of documenting stories. but his health began to decline. A fall in the bathroom resulted in a hip fracture that required surgery. The recovery was slow and painful. There were weeks when he couldn't get out of bed, much less walk through the community recording stories. It was a difficult time for the old man. His entire life had been defined by movement and action. Being confined to bed was as psychologically devastating as it was physically painful. But the community he had served for so long now served him. People came to visit, brought food, sat by his bedside, and shared stories he could record from right there. Caleb and Maya made sure to bring Grace to visit her Mr. Arthur regularly. The 3-year-old girl, with her boundless energy and endless questions, brought life to the old man's room. He taught her old songs, told simplified stories about how things were when he was a child. Grace listened, fascinated, absorbing every word. Eleanor began to help her Mr. Arthur with organizing the recordings. It was meticulous work of categorizing, transcribing, preserving. It required patience and attention to detail. Eleanor discovered she enjoyed the work. There was something meaningful about preserving those voices and stories for future generations. It was so different from the performative charity committees she used to frequent, where the emphasis was on being seen doing good rather than on the good itself. Through this work, Eleanor heard stories from dozens of elderly people. Each had lived a full life with joys and sorrows, successes and failures, loves and losses. And Eleanor realized that the most satisfying lives were not necessarily the richest materially. They were the lives lived with authenticity, with deep connections, with purpose beyond accumulation. One of the stories that touched Eleanor the most was that of Mrs. Mariana, an 88-year-old lady who had worked as a housemaid her entire life. Mariana never had much. She raised 3 children alone after her husband left when she was 35. She worked until she was 75, cleaning houses to survive. But when she spoke about her life, there was no bitterness. There was pride for the children she raised, for the grandchildren she adored, for the community she helped build through small acts of kindness over decades. Eleanor asked Mariana if she regretted anything, if she would change anything if she could. The old lady thought for a long moment before answering. She said she wished she had had more time with her children when they were small instead of always working, more time with friends before many passed away. But she did not regret the choices she made. They were the only ones she could make given the circumstances she faced. The conversation made Eleanor reflect deeply. She had all the time that Mariana did not have, but she wasted it on meaningless things. While Mariana worked to survive, Eleanor had the luxury of choosing how to spend her days, but chose to pursue appearances and status. The irony was painful but necessary. Richard was also going through his own ongoing transformation. The agricultural cooperative he had helped establish now operated independently, no longer needing his constant supervision. This left him with free time he didn't know how to fill. For the first time in decades, he had no business meetings, no crises to resolve, no frenetic pace that had always defined his life. Initially, he tried to fill the void with new projects. He began learning about sustainable energy, thinking of implementing solutions in the community. But he realized he was falling into the same pattern, defining himself through work and achievements. What he really needed to learn was simply to be, not always to be doing. Maya suggested he spend time with Grace, not just visiting occasionally, but truly spending time, taking her for walks in the countryside, teaching her about plants and animals, simply playing without a goal or agenda. Richard found the suggestion strange at first. What exactly does one do with a 3-year-old for hours without structure or a plan? But he started trying. The first few times were awkward and strange. Richard didn't know how to turn off his business brain and just be present with a child. Grace seemed to sense this and didn't connect with him. But Richard persisted, gradually learning to slow down, to see the world through his granddaughter's curious eyes. One day, weeks after starting this process, something shifted. Richard and Grace were walking through the countryside when the little girl stopped to watch an ant carrying a leaf 3 times its size. Grace was fascinated, asking questions about where the ant was going, if it had a family, if it got tired. Richard, instead of giving short, hurried answers, sat down on the grass beside his granddaughter and really watched the ants with her. They stayed there for almost an hour, just watching and talking. Richard didn't think once about meetings or business. He was completely present in that moment with his granddaughter, marveling at something as simple as ants working. When they finally returned home, Grace held his hand and chatted excitedly about the ants, and Richard felt a peace he hadn't felt in decades. Caleb watched this transformation in Richard with a mixture of skepticism and hope. Part of him still saw the man who had allowed the humiliation at the wedding. But he also saw Richard's genuine effort to change. He saw how he interacted with Grace with a patience and presence that clearly didn't come naturally, but that he forced himself to cultivate. One afternoon, Caleb and Richard were alone, while Maya and Eleanor went into town to take care of some things. Richard seized the opportunity for a conversation he'd been putting off for a long time. He apologized to Caleb formally, not just for the laughter and mockery at the wedding, but for all the prejudice he had carried, for judging Caleb as inferior without even knowing him. The apology was clearly difficult for Richard. He wasn't a man accustomed to admitting mistakes or showing vulnerability. But there he was, voice trembling, eyes misty, asking for genuine forgiveness. Caleb listened in silence, processing his own emotions. Part of him still carried hurt, but he had learned from Nana Mildred that resentment is a weight that hurts the bearer more than the recipient. Caleb extended his hand and Richard shook it. There was no hug or effusive words of total reconciliation, but it was a start, an acknowledgement that they were both trying, and that was worth something. For Caleb, seeing Richard interact with Grace with such care spoke louder than any verbal apology could. Honey, the calf that had caused so much chaos at the wedding, was now a grown, gentle steer. He had become a sort of mascot for the property, especially adored by Grace. The little girl wasn't afraid of the large animal. She would climb on his back when Caleb allowed it, feed him grass from her hands. There was something poetic in that, Caleb thought. The animal that was a symbol of humiliation was now a symbol of his daughter's innocent joy. The agricultural cooperative that Richard had helped found celebrated its 3rd anniversary. The event was marked by a large gathering in the community's central square. There was food prepared by dozens of families, live music played by local musicians, children running and playing. It was simple but beautiful, full of genuine joy. Caleb was invited to speak, representing the farmers. He had prepared a few words, but when he stepped onto the small makeshift stage and saw all the faces looking at him, the prepared words evaporated. Instead, he spoke from the heart. About how 3 years ago his marriage had been a subject of mockery, but had become the catalyst for change in so many lives. About how the community had embraced not only him, but also the wealthy people who had come to mock but stayed to learn. He thanked Richard Sterling by name, acknowledging that without the initial investment and expertise, the cooperative would never have gotten off the ground. But he also made it clear that the real success came from the collective work, from the willingness of dozens of families to collaborate instead of compete. It was about community, not individuals. Richard, listening from the middle of the crowd, felt a deep emotion. He had spent decades building businesses where success was measured in profit and growth. But this thriving, united community felt like the most significant achievement of his life. And the irony was that he achieved it only when he stopped trying to be the leader, when he allowed himself to be just a collaborator among many. Maya also spoke briefly about how her personal journey of reconciling 2 worlds had taught her students about authenticity and courage. She shared letters she had received from former students, now young adults, saying that the lessons they learned in her classroom about honoring roots and being true to themselves had helped them in important life decisions. Eleanor listened from the front row, tears streaming silently. She thought about how she had almost destroyed it all, how her shame and fear had almost cost her not only the relationship with her daughter, but this entire network of connections and transformations that radiated from that chaotic wedding day. The gratitude she felt toward Maya for being brave enough not to give in to the pressure was immense. When the celebration ended and people began to disperse, some neighbors brought a surprise gift for Caleb and Maya. They had pooled money and resources to build a small addition to the couple's house. It wasn't large, just an extra room, but it was built by the community's own hands. For when they have their second child, they explained, or just to have more space for Grace to grow. Maya and Caleb were speechless. It wasn't the grandness of the gesture in material terms, it was what it represented. It was the community saying they saw them, that they cared, that they were all in this together. Caleb, who rarely cried, had to turn his face away and take several deep breaths to maintain his composure. That night, after everyone had left and Grace was asleep, Caleb and Maya stood on the small porch watching the stars. They did this occasionally when they needed a quiet moment together. They didn't talk much sometimes. They just stood there, side by side, remembering the solidity of their partnership. Maya broke the silence by commenting that she was pregnant again. Caleb turned so fast he almost knocked over the chair he was sitting on. Pregnant, Maya confirmed, saying she had found out that morning but wanted to wait for the right moment to tell. She thought that after the celebration, in that moment of shared peace, was the right time. Caleb hugged her and they both cried. They were tears of joy mixed with fear. They knew things would be even more difficult financially with another child, but they also knew they would be okay. They had each other. They had Grace. They had an entire community that supported them. They had everything that really mattered. Maya's pregnancy was different from the first. She had more experience now, knew what to expect. But she also had Grace to care for, and that made everything more challenging. There were days when she was exhausted, with severe morning sickness, trying to keep a 3-year-old active and happy. Caleb helped as much as he could, but he also had work that couldn't be postponed. It was Nana Mildred who helped the most. The elderly lady, despite her own fragile health, made a point of coming every day to spend time with Grace. Sometimes they would just sit together on the porch, Nana Mildred telling stories and Grace drawing. Other days they made simple cookies in the kitchen, Grace helping to mix and shape the dough with her small hands. Eleanor also increased her presence. She came 3 times a week, helping with household chores, taking Grace for walks so Maya could rest. The relationship between mother and daughter had been completely transformed. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of friction, but there was mutual respect and genuine love. Richard Sterling built a simple playground in Caleb and Maya's backyard. It wasn't elaborate, just a few swings and a small wooden playhouse. But it was made with care. Each board sanded smooth so it wouldn't splinter, each screw tightened securely. Grace loved it, spending hours playing there while Caleb worked within view of the house. Tiffany and Brandon started bringing Tyler to play with Grace regularly. Initially, Tyler was hesitant around the younger girl, but Grace, with the confidence small children have, simply included him in her games without question. Tyler gradually loosened up, and it was beautiful to see the 10-year-old boy who had arrived so hurt now laughing and playing genuinely. Tyler's birth parents had lost custody due to severe neglect years ago. The boy carried deep trauma from that time, but in the safety of Tiffany and Brandon's home, with the support of the extended community, he was beginning to heal. It wouldn't be a linear or quick process and there would be setbacks, but the direction was clear. Justin and Sarah, after 2 years of careful dating, decided to move in together. It was a big decision, especially considering Sarah's daughter, Chloe. The 14-year-old girl had strong opinions about a new man in her mother's life. Justin understood, respected that. He didn't try to force a father-daughter relationship. He just made himself consistently present, respectful and genuine. It took 6 months for Chloe to start opening up to Justin. The turning point was when she casually mentioned she wanted to learn woodworking. Justin, without fanfare, offered to teach her. They started spending Saturday mornings in the workshop. At first, Chloe was all crossed arms and one-word answers. But gradually, as she learned to measure, cut, sand, something changed. The wood didn't judge. The work had clear rules and tangible results. If you measured wrong, the piece wouldn't fit. If you sanded carefully, it became smooth. It was honest in a way many things in life weren't. Chloe began to appreciate that, and by extension, she began to appreciate the man who patiently taught without forcing connection or affection. Heather and Stephen got married in a ceremony even simpler than Maya and Caleb's. It was in Stephen's backyard, with only 20 people present. There was no elaborate decoration or big party, just a guitarist playing soft music, honest vows exchanged, and a shared dinner afterward. But there was something deeply beautiful in the simplicity. Stephen cried as he made his vows, talking about how Heather had given him hope that it was possible to love again after loss. Heather, in turn, spoke about how Stephen had taught her that vulnerability was strength, not weakness. There was no audience to impress, no performativity. It was just two people genuinely committing to each other. Eleanor and Richard watched the ceremony and later remarked to each other how different it was from their own wedding. They had married in a huge church with 300 guests, an imported dress, a live band, everything planned to impress. But there was no substance beneath all that surface. Heather and Stephen had the opposite, all substance, minimal surface. The conversation led Eleanor and Richard to a surprising decision. They wanted to renew their vows, not an elaborate ceremony, but something simple and meaningful. They wanted to commit to each other again, but this time for real. Not as partners of social convenience, but as companions who were actively choosing to be together. They asked Mr. Arthur to officiate the renewal of vows. The old man, now recovered from his hip fracture but still using a cane, was honored. The ceremony took place on the same property where Caleb and Maya had married, in the same field that had witnessed so much drama and transformation. It was a Saturday afternoon, 5 years after that chaotic wedding. The same neighbors were present, but now as true friends of Eleanor and Richard, not as spectators to a spectacle. Caleb and Maya were there with Grace, now 5 years old, and the new baby, Leo, 6 months old. When Eleanor made her renewed vows to Richard, she didn't speak about empty commitment or partnership of convenience. She spoke about how he had loved her even when she didn't deserve love, how he had patiently waited while she navigated her own journey of healing, how he had transformed alongside her, and she apologized for all the years she hadn't truly valued him. Richard, in making his vows, admitted that he had married Eleanor for the wrong reasons initially, but he said that didn't matter anymore, because over 23 years, especially the last 5, he had learned to truly love her, not the false version she presented to the world, but the real person with all her flaws and beauty. There wasn't a dry eye among those present. Even Caleb, always so emotionally reserved, had to wipe away a few tears. There was something deeply moving about seeing two people who had almost destroyed everything find their way back to something real and solid. Nana Mildred, sitting in the front row next to Mr. Arthur, held her old friend's hand. Both had witnessed impressive transformations over their many years, but this was special. It was living proof that people can change, that it's never too late to choose authenticity over appearance, that true love can grow even in soil that seemed barren. After the ceremony, there was a shared meal. Each family had brought something, and the makeshift tables groaned under the weight of the food. They weren't sophisticated or expensive dishes. It was honest, tasty food, prepared with care by hands that knew their kitchens and recipes well. Maya watched everything while nursing Leo. 5 years. 5 years since that awful afternoon that almost destroyed everything. And look what it had become. Look at all the lives that had changed, at all the connections that had formed, at all the healing that had happened. She thought about how she had almost given up that day, how she had run to hide, crying from humiliation, how for a moment she had considered calling it all a mistake, ending the relationship with Caleb, going back to the life her mother approved of. If she had done that, none of this would have happened. Eleanor would still be trapped in her shame and falseness. Richard would still be building empty empires. Tiffany and Brandon would still be stuck in a loveless marriage. Justin, Heather, everyone would still be living lives that weren't truly their own. But Maya hadn't given up. With help from Caleb's strength, Aunt Alice's support, and Nana Mildred's wisdom, she had persisted, and the reward was there, all around her. Not in material things or social status, but in true connections, in real transformations, in lives lived with purpose and authenticity. Caleb joined her, sitting beside her on the grass. Grace was running nearby with Tyler and other children, their laughter echoing across the field. Leo nursed peacefully, his little eyes closed in contentment. Caleb put his arm around Maya, and they stayed there, watching their extended and chosen families, feeling a deep peace. But life, as always, continued to bring challenges. Several months after Eleanor and Richard Sterling's vow renewal, Nana Mildred fell seriously ill. What began as a simple cold turned into pneumonia. At her advanced age and with already fragile health, It was a serious situation. Caleb was devastated. Nana Mildred wasn't just his grandmother. She was his surrogate mother, his mentor, his rock. The thought of losing her was unbearable. He spent every day in the small room where she rested, holding her hand, talking to her even when she was too weak to respond much. Maya cared for Grace and Leo alone during those weeks, without complaint. She understood what Nana Mildred meant to Caleb, but there was also fear in her heart. She had loved the old lady, like the grandmother she never had. The thought that Grace and Leo would grow up without knowing that incredible woman better was painful. The community mobilized as it always did. Neighbors brought food for Caleb and his family. Others visited Nana Mildred, telling stories to keep her engaged and fighting. Mr. Arthur spent hours by his old friend's bedside, reminiscing about decades of shared stories, making her laugh even in her weakened state. Eleanor surprised everyone by taking on the unofficial role of care coordinator. She created a shift system, so someone was always with Nana Mildred. She prepared nutritious broths and made sure the old lady took her medications on time. She did everything with a dedication that revealed how much she had come to love that woman who had confronted her at Maya's wedding and then welcomed her without judgment. It was 3 weeks of uncertainty. There were nights when it seemed Nana Mildred was slipping away, her breathing weak and irregular. But then she would fight back, opening her eyes in the morning, asking for coffee with that hoarse but determined voice. The old lady was stubborn, everyone knew, and her stubbornness served her well now. Gradually, Nana Mildred began to improve. The fever broke, the cough subsided, she began to eat more, and on a particularly beautiful sunny day, she asked to be taken to the porch where she could feel the warmth on her aching bones. Caleb cried openly with relief when he saw his grandmother sitting on the porch, a blanket over her shoulders, smiling at the sun. She wasn't fully recovered. It would take months to return to her normal strength. But she was alive. She was fighting, and that was enough. The experience changed Caleb in ways he was still processing. Seeing his grandmother so close to leaving forced him to confront the reality that she was mortal, that he wouldn't have her forever. It made him appreciate each moment, each conversation, each shared story even more. But it also revealed something about himself that Caleb didn't like. He realized that during those frightening weeks, he had emotionally withdrawn from Maya and the children. He was so consumed by the fear of losing Nana Mildred that he had neglected the people who also needed him. Maya never complained, but Caleb saw the tiredness in her eyes, the weight of carrying everything alone. When Nana Mildred was out of danger, Caleb sat down with Maya and apologized. He acknowledged that he had let her carry too much of the burden, that he had been so focused on one important relationship that he had neglected others equally important. Maya held his face in her hands and said she understood, that she held no grudge. But she also said they needed to talk about creating a better balance when future crises arose. The conversation was productive and honest. They established some rules. Even in times of crisis, Caleb needed to set aside time to be present with his immediate family. Maya needed to communicate when she was at her limit, not just hold everything together until she broke. They needed to be a real team, not just when things were good, but especially when they were difficult. Caleb and Maya's 7th wedding anniversary arrived. They didn't do anything elaborate. They only had dinner together after the children fell asleep, talking about the last 7 years, about how much they had grown individually and as a couple. Caleb said something Maya would keep forever. He said if he could go back in time to that chaotic wedding day, he wouldn't change a thing. Yes, it was awful. Yes, it was humiliating. But from that humiliation, so much good was born. True connections were born, deep transformations, a community united in a way rarely seen. If the price for all that was some temporary humiliation, Caleb would pay it again without hesitation. Maya agreed. She thought of all the lives touched, Eleanor finally free from decades of shame, Richard discovering real purpose, Tiffany and Brandon building a true family, Justin finding work he loved, Heather experiencing genuine love, and so many others touched directly or indirectly by that day and its repercussions. The agricultural cooperative continued to thrive. It now included 45 families and had expanded to include not just farming but also local crafts. Some of the women in the community had started making handmade crafts, bags and clothes from sustainable materials. The work was sold at regional markets, bringing in important additional income. Aunt Alice led one of the craft groups. At 68, she had arthritis that made some work difficult, but her creative vision and decades of experience were invaluable. She taught younger women traditional techniques that were being lost, ensuring that knowledge was passed to the next generations. Sarah, Justin's girlfriend, also joined the group. Her expertise in construction and renovation brought a unique perspective on functional design. She and Aunt Alice became unlikely friends, women from different generations, but with deep mutual respect. Mr. Arthur finally completed the story documentation project. It was over 200 hours of recordings, hundreds of stories preserved. The partner university helped transcribe everything and create an accessible digital archive. It was a moment of celebration when the project was officially launched. The launch happened at the school where Maya worked. Students, teachers, community members, everyone came. Mr. Arthur, now 76 and visibly moved, spoke about the importance of preserving stories, about how every life lived had value, had lessons, had contributions to make, and about how it was everyone's responsibility to ensure those stories weren't lost. Nana Mildred, recovered but even more fragile than before, sat in the front row. Her story was among those recorded, detailing decades of life, raising children alone, building community through small, consistent acts of kindness. When Mr. Arthur specifically mentioned her impact on the community, she waved her hand dismissively, but everyone could see the tears in her eyes, the pride in knowing her life would be remembered and valued. Grace, now 6 and already learning to read, was fascinated by the archive. She would have Maya open the transcriptions at home, trying to read the stories with her still hesitant reading. Maya would help her, explaining difficult words, providing context. It was beautiful to see her daughter connecting with stories from previous generations, understanding she was part of something bigger than herself. Leo, almost 2, was in the phase of unlimited energy and endless curiosity. He reminded Maya of Caleb in miniature. He had that same stubborn determination, that same brutal honesty that was sometimes inconvenient. When he didn't like something, he made it very clear. When he loved something, he showed it with total enthusiasm. Raising 2 children with such different temperaments was challenging. Grace was more introspective. She liked listening to stories and drawing. Leo needed constant movement, physical exploration of the world. Maya and Caleb learned to balance both children's needs, to give each child what they needed, without neglecting the other. There was a particularly revealing moment when Grace, feeling neglected because Leo demanded so much attention with his 2 years of age, asked if her parents loved her brother more than her. The question broke Maya's heart. She sat down with Grace and explained that love is not a limited quantity. It's not that we love Leo more or less. We love differently, because each person is unique and needs different things. The conversation led to a new tradition. Every week, Maya spent one afternoon alone with Grace, just the 2 of them. Sometimes they went for walks, other times they just stayed home drawing or reading. The important thing was the dedicated, not divided time. Caleb did the same with Leo, taking the boy to help with chores on the property, teaching patiently when Leo wanted to hold tools or feed the animals. Tiffany and Brandon faced their own parenting challenges with Tyler, now 12. Adolescence was approaching, bringing with it new complexities. Tyler began asking questions about his biological parents, about why he was taken from them, about whether there was something wrong with him that made him be abandoned. They were difficult questions without easy answers. Tiffany and Brandon had undergone family therapy preparing for this moment, but theory and practice are different things. Brandon in particular struggled. He wanted to protect Tyler from all the pain, but knew he couldn't. That part of growing up was processing trauma and finding ways to live with scars. It was Nana Mildred who offered perspective when Brandon shared his struggles. She said that scars didn't mean broken. Scars were proof of healing, of having survived something difficult. Tyler would always carry the marks of his difficult beginning, but that didn't define him. What defined him was how he chose to live in spite of it, how he built his life from there on out. Brandon took those words to Tyler. They had a long, honest conversation about trauma, about healing, about how it's normal to want to understand the past, but important not to get stuck in it. Tyler listened with that serious expression he used when he was really processing something. He didn't have immediate answers, but Brandon could see the words were being absorbed. Justin and Sarah decided to get married after 3 years of living together. Chloe, now 17, helped plan the ceremony. It was her way of showing acceptance of Justin, of blessing the union. The ceremony would be small, in the backyard of the house they shared, similar to the other simple weddings that had become tradition in that community. But there was a moment of panic 2 weeks before the wedding. Chloe discovered she was pregnant. She had a boyfriend from school that Sarah didn't completely approve of. They were both too young, still in high school. The news was a shock that shook the entire family dynamic. Sarah was furious initially. She yelled things she later regretted. Chloe cried and said she had ruined everything, that Sarah probably didn't even want to marry Justin anymore if she had a problematic daughter. It was Justin who brought calm. He sat down with both of them and said yes, the situation was complicated, but it didn't change anything fundamental. They were still a family, they still loved each other, and they would face this together. The conversation that followed was long and difficult. Chloe needed to decide what she wanted to do. Sarah needed to process her own emotions while supporting her daughter. Justin needed to navigate his role as stepfather in a delicate situation. But they talked, honestly, without avoiding difficult topics. Chloe decided to continue the pregnancy. It was an enormous choice for someone so young. The boyfriend, when told, was in complete panic initially. But her parents, after the initial shock, offered support. The two families began working together to figure out how to support 2 teenagers who would soon be parents. Justin and Sarah's wedding happened as planned. Chloe was there, 5 months pregnant now, helping with the final arrangements. There was something poetic about it. A simple but love-filled wedding, with a pregnant teenager helping, proving that true family embraces complexity and imperfection. Heather and Stephen, watching the wedding, reflected on their own journeys. They had been married for almost 4 years now. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments when Stephen grew quiet and distant, lost in memories of his late wife. There were still moments when Heather felt jealous of a ghost, but they had learned to navigate it with honest communication and mutual patience. Eleanor watched everything with wiser eyes than years before. She saw Chloe pregnant and young and felt empathy, not judgment. She remembered herself pregnant with Maya, young and scared, trying to hide her fear behind masks of competence. She approached Chloe in a quiet moment and offered support. Not unsolicited advice or disguised judgments, just offered to be available if the young woman needed to talk. Chloe, surprised by the kindness, accepted. In the following weeks, she and Eleanor developed an unlikely relationship. Eleanor shared stories of her own young motherhood, of the fears and challenges. Chloe listened, realizing she wasn't alone, that others had navigated similar paths and survived. Richard continued his work with the cooperative, but also started a new project. He was helping young people in the region who wanted to start small businesses. He offered free consulting, helped with business plans, connected people to resources. It was rewarding work in a way his profitable ventures never were. One of the young people Richard mentored was JJ, the 18-year-old son of one of Caleb's neighbors. JJ had an idea to create a rural property maintenance company using sustainable techniques. Richard saw real potential there and invested not only time, but also seed money to help JJ get started. JJ's business grew quickly. There was real demand for his services, and the young man had an impressive work ethic, waking before sunrise and working until dark. It reminded Richard of Caleb years ago, that same unwavering dedication and honesty in every transaction. Caleb, seeing JJ thrive, felt pride. Not in a possessive or paternalistic way, but the genuine pride of seeing young people from the community finding their paths. It was proof that what he and Maya had started, what that chaotic marriage had catalyzed, had deep roots now. It was perpetuating itself through new generations. Maya started a new project at the school where she worked. She created a program where students interviewed elderly people from the community, documenting their life stories. It was inspired by Mr. Arthur's work, but focused on involving the next generation. 12 and 13-year-old students sat with people in their 70s, 80s, 90s, asking questions, recording answers, learning about how life was different decades ago. The program was surprisingly successful. Students who were normally bored and uninterested became fascinated by the stories. Elderly people who felt invisible and forgotten blossomed with the genuine attention and interest. Intergenerational connections formed, bridges between worlds that normally didn't touch. Grace participated in the program even though she was younger than the normal age. Her passionate interest in stories and her maturity for her age convinced Maya to make an exception. Grace interviewed Nana Mildred, asking questions with that unfiltered curiosity that children have. The resulting recording was a treasure trove of memories, Nana Mildred sharing stories she had never told before, prompted by the unique questions of a child. Listening to the recording later, Caleb cried. They were tears of gratitude. Gratitude for that moment having been captured, for Grace to have that record of the great-grandmother she loved. When Nana Mildred eventually passed, and everyone knew that day would come, Grace would have not just vague memories but preserved words, stories told in Nana Mildred's own voice. Time kept passing. Grace turned 8. Leo reached 4. Nana Mildred celebrated her 80th birthday in a celebration the entire community attended. Tyler became a full teenager at 13, navigating that difficult age with support from Tiffany and Brandon. Chloe had her baby, a healthy girl she named Faith, and surprised everyone with how good a mother she was despite her young age. Eleanor completed 10 years of consistent therapy. It was a milestone she celebrated quietly, only with Richard and Maya. 10 years of hard work to unpack decades of self-inflicted trauma and shame. It wasn't a linear process. There were moments of regression, weeks when she felt she was back at the beginning, but the overall progress was undeniable. She was not the same woman who had orchestrated that public humiliation 10 years earlier. Caleb and Maya celebrated a decade of marriage. This time, they had a small but meaningful celebration. They renewed their vows, not because something was wrong, but because they wanted to consciously reaffirm their choices. 10 years. They had started so young, so naive about the challenges they would face. Over that decade, they faced financial difficulties, family health problems, the normal tensions of two individuals learning to live as one. But they also experienced deep joys, immense personal growth, and the satisfaction of building something real and solid together. In her renewed vows, Maya spoke about how Caleb had taught her the meaning of constancy, how he was there, day after day, not just in the photogenic moments, but especially in the difficult and boring ones, how that constancy had created a foundation of security that allowed her to grow and take risks. Caleb, in making his vows, spoke about how Maya had challenged him to be more than just an honest worker. She had pushed him to dream bigger, to believe he deserved not just to survive but to thrive, how she had taught him that vulnerability was courage, not weakness. Mr. Arthur, who had renewed his own vows a decade earlier, said he saw in that couple the same essence he and June had. Not perfection, but true commitment. The willingness to show up every day and do the work of love, even when it's hard, even when it's boring. But life still had one final lesson to teach, one that no one expected. 3 months after the 10-year wedding celebration, Nana Mildred had another health episode. This time it was her heart, weak after 8 decades of life lived with intensity. The doctors did what they could, but everyone knew the time was approaching. Nana Mildred was conscious and lucid. She wasn't afraid, she told everyone who visited. She had lived a full life, had loved deeply, had seen her efforts bear fruit beyond what she had imagined. She was at peace. Caleb was not at peace. The idea of losing the grandmother who had been mother, mentor, everything to him was devastating. He spent days by her bedside, holding her hand, unable to accept that this force of nature could really leave. It was Nana Mildred who finally confronted him. In a weak but firm voice, she told Caleb that he needed to let her go, that he should not carry guilt for living fully after she was gone. That life goes on, and that is beautiful, not sad. Caleb cried as he had never cried before, not just for the imminent loss, but releasing decades of pent-up pain. The loss of his parents as a teenager, the difficult years of struggle, all the moments he pretended to be strong when he was breaking inside. Nana Mildred held his large, calloused hand between her small, frail ones, letting him cry without judgment or shame. Maya arrived with the children. Grace, now 8 and understanding more than they wished, was frightened but trying to be brave. Leo, at 4, didn't fully comprehend, but felt the sadness around him. Nana Mildred called the children close. To Grace, she said to never forget that stories matter, that every person she met had a story worth hearing. That curiosity and empathy were the greatest gifts she could give the world. Grace promised, tears streaming down her young face. To Leo, she said to always be honest, even when it was hard. That integrity wasn't something you had sometimes, but something you practiced always. Leo, not fully understanding but sensing the importance, nodded seriously. Eleanor was there too. In recent years, she and Nana Mildred had developed a real friendship. Eleanor had helped with care when the old lady was sick, and Nana Mildred had offered the wisdom and lack of judgment that Eleanor desperately needed. Nana Mildred held Eleanor's hand and said something no one else heard, something that made Eleanor cry but also smile. Later, Eleanor never shared what was said, keeping those final words as the old lady's private gift. Richard, Alice, Tiffany, Brandon, Tyler, Justin, Sarah, Heather, Stephen all came to say goodbye. Each received specific words, final advice, a blessing. Nana Mildred used her last reserves of energy, making sure each person knew how loved and valued they were. Mr. Arthur was the last. The two old friends looked at each other, decades of shared history passing between them without need for words. Mr. Arthur finally spoke, saying he'd see her on the other side, but that he wasn't ready to go yet. Nana Mildred laughed, that weak but genuine laugh, and said he'd have to wait because he still had work to do here. She passed peacefully that night, Caleb holding one hand, Maya the other. Her face, when her breathing finally stopped, was serene, almost smiling. The funeral was 3 days later. The whole community attended, and many from outside too. People Nana Mildred had helped over decades, whose lives she had touched in big and small ways. The simple church was packed, people standing at the back, others outside listening through makeshift speakers. It wasn't a sad service. Nana Mildred had left clear instructions. She wanted celebration, not mourning. She wanted music, stories, laughter. And that's exactly what she got. Caleb spoke, his voice trembling but firm. He told stories of growing up with Nana Mildred, of being raised by her after losing his parents. He spoke of how she taught him not through sermons, but through consistent example, how she demonstrated every day what it meant to live with integrity. Maya shared about how Nana Mildred had welcomed her without hesitation, how the old lady never judged her choices, only offered support and wisdom when asked, how that unconditional acceptance helped Maya accept herself and find peace. Eleanor spoke, surprising some who still remembered the woman who orchestrated the humiliation 10 years prior. She told of how Nana Mildred confronted her that day, not with cruelty, but with hard truth that needed to be said, and how in the following years, the old lady guided Eleanor through a journey of transformation with patience and wisdom. The stories continued. Every person had something to share. Moments when Nana Mildred had offered the right word at the right time. Times when she had shown up with food when someone was struggling. How she remembered birthdays and important events in everyone's life, making each person feel seen and valued. When they finally lowered her into the earth, the sun was setting. There was something poetic about it. The end of a day, the end of an era. Caleb threw the first shovelful of earth, followed by Maya, the children, and then everyone else. One by one, each person present offered their final gesture of farewell. In the weeks after the funeral, Caleb struggled, not just with the loss, though that was immense, but with an existential question about purpose. Nana Mildred had been his rock, his guide. Without her, he felt lost in a way he hadn't since his parents passed away decades ago. Maya was patient, but also honest. She told Caleb that grief was normal and necessary, but that he couldn't lose himself in it, that he had responsibilities, not just to her and the children, but to the community that depended on him. That Nana Mildred wouldn't want to see him falling apart. It was Richard, surprisingly, who brought the turning point for Caleb. He showed up one afternoon and simply stayed. He didn't offer empty words of comfort or try to fix anything. He was just present, working alongside Caleb in silence, offering his solid presence. After hours of working together, Richard finally spoke. He said he saw Caleb carrying Nana Mildred's legacy not as a burden, but as a blessing. That everything she taught, all the values she instilled, lived through him now. That the best way to honor her wasn't through endless mourning, but by living the principles she exemplified. The words resonated. Caleb realized Richard was right. Nana Mildred hadn't completely left. She lived through him, through Maya, through all the people whose lives she had touched. Her legacy was active, not passive. Caleb began to emerge from the paralyzing grief. He didn't forget. He didn't stop missing her. But he began to function again. He returned to work with renewed purpose. He spent more time with Grace and Leo, teaching them the same lessons Nana Mildred had taught him. The agricultural cooperative decided to create a memorial fund in Nana Mildred's name. It would be used to help families in need, the same way she had always done individually. Caleb was elected to manage the fund, an honor he accepted with humility. Mr. Arthur, now 79, and also feeling the loss of his old friend deeply, found new purpose. He began writing a book about the stories he had collected, especially focusing on the life lessons that emerged from them. It was slow work, his arthritic fingers making typing difficult. But it was important. It was his way of ensuring those voices, especially Nana Mildred's, would never be silenced. Maya continued her program at the school, now dedicating it to Nana Mildred's memory. Every interview students conducted, every story they documented, was a small tribute to the woman who understood deeply the value of preserving human narratives. The house where Nana Mildred had lived, where Caleb grew up, stood empty for a time. It was small and simple, needing repairs. Caleb couldn't decide what to do with it. Selling felt like a betrayal. Leaving it empty felt like a waste. It was Grace who suggested turning it into a community space, a place where people could gather, share stories, teach traditional skills to younger generations. An informal community center that would honor Nana Mildred's spirit. The idea captured everyone's imagination. The community mobilized to renovate the little house. Caleb led the work, each new board placed with care, each wall painted with love. Richard provided materials and expertise. Eleanor coordinated donations of furniture and decorations. Alice and her crafting group created special pieces to adorn the space. Tiffany and Brandon brought Tyler to help with physical labor. The 15-year-old teenager was now strong and capable, and working with his hands alongside men from the community gave him a sense of belonging he had never had before. Justin used his woodworking skills to create beautiful and functional shelves. Sarah installed proper lighting and made small structural repairs. Heather and Stephen organized a library of donated books that filled the shelves. When it was ready, the Mildred Community Center was inaugurated in a simple but moving ceremony. Grace cut the ceremonial ribbon, trembling with pride and responsibility. Leo, now 5 years old, immediately ran to explore every corner of the space that spoke so much about the great-grandmother he had known, but who now existed mainly in stories. The center quickly became the heart of the community. Every Thursday night, there was a story circle where elders shared memories and young people listened. Saturday mornings there were workshops on traditional skills, weaving, basic carpentry, traditional cooking, planting according to the seasons. Sunday afternoons, it was an open space for meetings, celebrations, or simply spending time together. Mr. Arthur was often there, sitting in a comfortable chair that Caleb had built especially for him, telling stories to anyone who would listen. He would turn 80 next month, and although his body was frail, his mind remained as sharp as ever. Eleanor found renewed purpose helping to manage the center. She created a scheduling system for workshops, coordinated volunteers, and ensured the space was always clean and welcoming. It was work unlike anything she had done before, but it brought a satisfaction that decades of elaborate social events never had. Richard continued working with young entrepreneurs. JJJ, his first mentee, now had a thriving business and was beginning to mentor others. It was a beautiful cycle, knowledge and support being passed forward, growing and multiplying. Tiffany and Brandon celebrated 10 years of adopting Tyler. The teenager, now 17, was finishing high school with excellent grades. It had been a long and difficult journey, with moments when everyone doubted they would make it. But there he was, a healthy and well-adjusted young man, planning for college and the future, with a confidence he wouldn't have had without the solid foundation Tiffany and Brandon provided. Justin and Sarah were also raising faith alongside Chloe. The girl was now 3 years old, vibrant and full of life. Chloe, who had her at 17, was now 20 and working part-time while finishing her studies. It hadn't been easy, but the support of Sarah and Justin and the extended community had made it possible. Heather and Stephen had decided not to have children of their own, but they became deeply involved as de facto aunt and uncle to the community's children. Stephen gave free music lessons at the community center, teaching children to play guitar and sing. Heather organized a book club for teenagers, exposing them to literature they might never find on their own. 12 years after that chaotic wedding, the community was unrecognizable but also essentially the same. Physically, there were changes. New houses had been built. The cooperative had expanded its operations. The community center was a new addition. But essentially, it was still a place where people knew each other by name, where neighbors helped neighbors, where community meant something real. Caleb and Maya, now 40 and 38 respectively, looked back and barely recognized the frightened young people who married under mockery 12 years ago. They had grown so much, individually and together. They faced financial difficulties, health problems, family tensions, the loss of Nana Mildred. But they emerged stronger, more connected, more certain of their choices. Grace was 10 years old, already showing an interest in teaching as a future career. She loved the story program at her mother's school. She loved the Mildred Community Center. She saw how narratives connected people, how understanding other people's stories created empathy and understanding. She wanted to do that professionally someday. Leo, at 7, was exactly as Caleb had predicted. Stubborn, honest to a fault, a tireless worker for the things that mattered to him. He loved working with animals, helping his father with chores on the property. He already talked about being a farmer when he grew up, about continuing the work that generations before him had done. Eleanor completed 12 years of therapy and decided it was time to pause. Not because she was cured, she understood that healing from deep trauma was a lifelong process, but because she had the tools now. She knew how to recognize when old patterns resurfaced. She knew how to ask for help when needed. She knew how to be kind to herself when she failed. She and Richard had built something real over the last 12 years. It wasn't the burning passion of young lovers. It was a solid partnership of mature people who actively chose to be together every day. They argued, of course. They had differences and frustrations. But they had learned to navigate conflict in a healthy way, to not let resentments fester. On a particularly beautiful Saturday afternoon, the entire extended community gathered at the Mildred Community Center for a simple celebration. There was no specific occasion, just a celebration of being together, of everything they had built collectively, of all the lives that were intertwined in that web of connections. There was food prepared by dozens of hands, music played by local musicians, children running and playing, elders sitting in a circle, talking about old times and current times, teenagers in their own groups navigating that tricky age with more or less grace. Caleb and Maya stood in a corner watching everything. Maya held Caleb's hand and he squeezed it gently. They didn't need to say anything. They were both thinking the same thing. If someone had told them 12 years ago, on that awful afternoon of the mocked wedding, that it would lead to this, they never would have believed it. But here they were. Not just survivors, but thriving. Not just them, but dozens of people whose lives had been transformed directly or indirectly by that day and everything that came after. Maya looked at her mother, who was talking animatedly with Chloe about a craft project. She saw Richard playing with Leo, teaching his grandson something about wood or tools. She saw Tiffany and Brandon with Tyler, an improbable but genuine family. She saw Justin and Sarah, Heather and Stephen, all the couples who had found true love by witnessing hers. She saw the Mildred Community Center, the physical space that honored the memory of the woman who had meant so much to so many. She saw Grace helping Mr. Arthur with something, the 10-year-old already showing the patience and care for the elderly that would characterize her future. Caleb followed Maya's gaze, seeing the same things. He thought of Nana Mildred, wishing she could be there to see all this. But then he realized that in a way she was. In every lesson she had taught living on through all of them, in every value she had instilled being practiced daily, in every genuine connection that existed, because she had exemplified how to be a true and good human being. The sun began to set, casting that golden late afternoon light over everything. And in that light, in that moment, everything was exactly as it should be. End of story. This was a fictional story created to touch our hearts. Now tell us what you thought. Did you identify with any character in this story? Did Eleanor really manage to change? Or do you think certain pains never fully heal? And Caleb and Maya, do you believe their love would have survived without all that initial suffering? Share your honest opinion with us in the comments. We really want to know how you felt hearing this story. Thank you so much for your company up to this point. Don't forget to leave your like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other stories that will touch your heart.